Hello and welcome to another science lecture to help you rest. Tonight we will talk about the very first time our ancient human ancestors left their home continent. We will be discussing the event known as Out of Africa 1. This is not the story of our own species, Homo sapiens. This is a much older story about a much earlier kind of human who was the first to walk out of Africa and spread across the vast continents of Asia and Europe. It is the story of the first great human migration, a foundational chapter in the human story that set the stage for everything that came after. If you would like, you can subscribe to the channel for more lectures like this one, or leave a comment below. It helps the channel function. Speaking of comments, I have a question for you before we begin. The entire story tonight is about leaving home on a massive scale. So the question is this: what do you think is the single biggest reason a person or a group of people would decide to leave their home and never return? There is no right or wrong answer. Just think about it for a moment, and please write your thoughts in the comment section below. It is always interesting to see the different perspectives. Now please get comfortable. Lie back in your bed or in a comfortable chair. Dim the lights. There is no need to watch the screen. The information is all auditory. You can close your eyes and just listen to the sound of my voice. Allow your mind to settle. Do not try to memorize anything. Just let the words wash over you. The goal is not to study, but to have a calm and stable presence as you drift off. We are about to travel back in time almost 2 million years to a world very different from our own. We are going back to the beginning of the human journey. Part 1, the African cradle, setting the stage for departure. Our story does not begin with a journey. It begins long before the first step was ever taken. It begins at home. For early humans, home was Africa. To understand why they left, we must first understand the world they lived in and who they were. We need to set the stage and introduce the main character of this epic. So we must go back in time to a geological epoch known as the Pleistocene. The Pleistocene epoch began about 2.6 million years ago and lasted until about 11,700 years ago. This is an immense span of time. For our purposes, we are interested in the early part of the Pleistocene, around 1.8 or 1.9 million years ago. This period is often called the Ice Age, but that name can be a little misleading. It gives the impression of a world constantly frozen over. While it is true that during the Pleistocene, huge sheets of ice, or glaciers, advanced and retreated over the northern parts of the globe, the entire world was not a frozen wasteland. The effects of these glacial cycles in the north were felt all across the planet, including in Africa. Africa, being situated on the equator, did not get covered in massive ice sheets. Instead, it experienced dramatic shifts in its climate. When the world was in a cold glacial period, much of the planet's water was locked up in those giant ice sheets. This made the world as a whole much drier. In Africa, this meant that the lush forests would shrink and the vast open grasslands, the savannas, would expand. Deserts, like the Sahara, would also grow larger and more intense. Then, during warmer periods known as interglacials, the ice sheets would melt and retreat. This released enormous amounts of water back into the oceans and the atmosphere. For Africa, this often meant a period of much greater rainfall. The savannas would become greener and more productive, and the deserts would shrink. These cycles of wet and dry, of expanding grasslands and shrinking forests, happened over and over again for millions of years. This constantly changing environment was the backdrop for early human evolution. It was a world of instability and change, a world that placed a premium on the ability to adapt. An animal, or a species that could only live in one type of forest or one type of grassland, would be in trouble when the climate shifted. But a species that could survive in a variety of environments would have a much better chance. The specific part of Africa that is most important to our story is the Great Rift Valley. This is a massive geological feature, a long trench that runs for thousands of kilometers down the eastern side of the continent. It is a place where the African tectonic plate is slowly splitting apart. This process has created a unique landscape of volcanoes, mountains, deep valleys, and long, narrow lakes. It was in this dynamic and varied environment of East Africa that much of human evolution played out. The Rift Valley provided a rich tapestry of habitats, from dense woodlands along rivers to open savannas teeming with animals. It was here that our ancestors learned to walk on two legs, and it was here that they began to make the first stone tools. And it was from this African cradle, this dynamic and challenging homeland, that our main character would eventually emerge. The main character of this first great migration was an early human species known as Homo erectus. The name Homo erectus means upright man, a name given because when the first fossils were found, they represented a creature that clearly walked fully upright, just like we do. For our purposes, we can also use the name Homo ergaster, which some scientists use for the earlier African populations of this species. The debate over whether they are one species or two is a technical one. For our lecture, we can think of them as the same general type of early human, the one that first left Africa. So, what was Homo erectus like? If you were to travel back in time and see one, you would not mistake it for a modern human, but you would certainly recognize it as a relative. Let us start with their bodies. Homo erectus was the first of our ancestors to have a body shape and size very similar to our own. They were taller and more slender than the earlier hominins, the Australopithecines, who were much shorter and more ape-like. A male Homo erectus could stand well over 5 feet tall, and some fossils suggest they could be as tall as 6 feet. Their body proportions were also distinctly human. They had long legs and shorter arms, a stark contrast to apes, which have long arms for climbing in trees. These long legs were a critical adaptation. They were built for long-distance walking and possibly endurance running. Every part of their lower body seemed perfectly suited for covering large distances efficiently. They had a narrow pelvis, long thigh bones, and a human-like knee joint. Their feet were also modern, with a well-developed arch that would act as a shock absorber during walking and running. Unlike earlier ancestors, their big toe was in line with the other toes and was not grasping, showing that they had fully abandoned a life in the trees. Their entire skeleton, from the waist down, screamed of a creature that lived on the ground and moved across the open landscape. This adaptation for long-distance travel is a key piece of the puzzle. It suggests that Homo erectus was not a creature that stayed in one small patch of forest. They were roamers, explorers, capable of moving across the vast African savannas day after day. This ability to travel efficiently would have been crucial for finding food and water in a landscape where resources were often spread out and unpredictable. It was this body, built for walking, that would eventually carry them out of Africa and across the world. Now let us look at their head and face. This is where they looked most different from us. Their skull was long and low, not tall and rounded like ours. If you looked at it from the side, it would appear more like a football, whereas a modern human skull is more like a soccer ball. At the front, they had a very prominent, thick brow ridge, a solid bar of bone above their eyes. We modern humans have lost this feature almost entirely. Their forehead was sloped back, not vertical like ours, and behind the face the skull sloped downwards. They also lacked a chin. If you feel your own jaw, you will notice a bony point that juts forward at the bottom. Homo erectus did not have this. Their jaw simply sloped backwards from their teeth. Their face was also more projecting than ours, a feature we call prognathism. Inside this skull was a brain that was larger than any that had come before it, but still smaller than our own. The brain size of early Homo erectus was around 800 to 900 cubic centimeters. To put that in perspective, the brain of an earlier Australopithecine was around 400 to 500 cubic centimeters, about the size of a chimpanzee's brain. A modern human brain, on the other hand, averages around 1,350 cubic centimeters. So, Homo erectus represented a major leap in brain size. Their brain was about 2/3 the size of ours. This larger brain is incredibly significant. Brains are biologically very expensive. The human brain uses about 20% of our body's energy when we are at rest, even though it only makes up about 2% of our body weight. For an animal to evolve such a large and energy-hungry organ, there must have been a very good reason. It must have provided a significant survival advantage. What did this larger brain allow them to do? It almost certainly meant they were more intelligent and more adaptable than their ancestors. It likely allowed for more complex social behaviors, better communication, and a greater ability to solve problems. It was this brain that figured out how to make and use stone tools with greater skill and purpose. This intelligence, combined with their modern, striding body, made Homo erectus a formidable new creature on the African landscape. They were a new kind of animal, one that relied not just on physical strength or speed, but on its mind and its ability to create technology. This brings us to their tools. The technology of Homo erectus, at least in this early period, belonged to what archaeologists call the Oldowan stone tool industry. The name Oldowan comes from Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, a part of the Great Rift Valley where some of the first and most important of these tools were found. Oldowan tools are, to the untrained eye, extremely simple. You might even mistake one for just a broken rock. But they represent a monumental cognitive leap. They are the first evidence of our ancestors purposefully manufacturing objects to help them survive. Imagine an early Homo erectus wanting to make a tool. First, they would have to find the right kind of raw material. They would need a hard, fine-grained rock, like a basalt or a chert, something that would break in a predictable way and hold a sharp edge. This means they had to understand geology. They had to know which rocks in their environment were good for tool making and which were not. They had to be able to look at a rock and see the potential for a tool inside it. Once they had selected a suitable stone, a rounded cobble perhaps, they would need another stone to serve as a hammer. This hammerstone would also need to be hard and durable. The process of making the tool, called flint knapping, would then begin. The toolmaker would hold the cobble, or the core, in one hand. With the other hand, they would strike the edge of the core with the hammerstone at a precise angle and with just the right amount of force. If done correctly, a sharp piece of stone, called a flake, would break off. This flake was not just a waste product, it was a primary tool. The edge of a freshly struck stone flake is incredibly sharp, sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. These small, sharp flakes would have been perfect for tasks like slicing through the thick hide of a large animal or for cutting meat off the bone. They could have been used to sharpen a stick for digging or to cut tough plant fibers. The simple stone flake was a prehistoric utility knife, an incredibly versatile and important piece of technology. After a few flakes were removed, the original core stone would also be a useful tool. It would now have several sharp, jagged edges where the flakes had been detached. This heavier tool, often called a chopper, was good for different tasks. It could be used for heavy-duty work, like smashing open the leg bone of a large antelope to get at the rich, nutritious marrow inside. It could be used for chopping wood or breaking open large, hard-shelled fruits. The Oldowan toolkit, then, consisted of these two basic components, the sharp flake for cutting and slicing, and the heavy core or chopper for smashing and chopping. The ability to create these tools was revolutionary. It gave Homo erectus access to a whole new world of food. Without sharp tools, it is very difficult for a primate to process the carcass of a large animal. teeth are not good for slicing through tough skin, and fingers cannot tear apart thick muscle. But with a sharp flake in hand, Homo erectus could quickly butcher an animal, cutting away pieces of meat and carrying them to a safer location to eat. The choppers allowed them to get at the marrow inside bones and the brain inside the skull, both of which are incredibly rich in calories and fat. This new access to high-quality food, particularly meat and marrow, was probably a key factor in the evolution of their large brains. That expensive brain needed high-energy food to fuel it, and the stone tools were the key that unlocked that food source. So now we have our main character, Homo erectus, and their basic technology, the Oldowan toolkit. What was their daily life like on the plains of Pleistocene Africa? We must piece together a picture from scattered clues like animal bones with cut marks from stone tools, and the arrangements of fossils and artifacts at ancient sites. Life was a constant search for food, water, and safety. They likely lived in small, mobile groups of related individuals. Social cooperation would have been essential for survival. Living in a group provides more eyes to watch for predators and allows for the sharing of information such as the location of a water hole or a recent animal carcass. Their diet was probably very broad and flexible. They were omnivores, eating a wide variety of foods. They would have gathered edible plants, roots, tubers, fruits and nuts. They would have collected insects and bird eggs, and of course they ate meat. A major debate among scientists is how they acquired that meat. Were they mighty hunters capable of bringing down the large and dangerous animals of the African savanna? Or were they primarily scavengers, cleverly stealing meat from the kills of other, more powerful predators, like lions and saber-toothed cats? The answer is likely somewhere in the middle. They were probably opportunistic. If they came across a dead or dying animal, they would certainly not have passed up the opportunity for a meal. Using their stone tools, they could have quickly stripped the carcass of its meat and marrow before other scavengers, like hyenas, arrived. Scavenging in Pleistocene Africa would have been a dangerous business. The predators were larger and more numerous than they are today. There were giant hyenas, multiple species of saber-toothed cats, and large lions. Competing with these animals for food would have required intelligence, cooperation, and courage. A group of Homo erectus, armed with rocks and sharp sticks, might have been able to work together to drive a lone predator away from its kill for long enough to grab some food. It is also possible that they did some hunting, perhaps focusing on smaller, less dangerous animals, or targeting the young, old, or sick individuals of larger species. The image of Homo erectus as a pure, heroic hunter is probably an exaggeration, but so is the image of them as a timid scavenger, cowering in the bushes. They were likely a highly adaptable and resourceful combination of both, a creature that used its clever mind to find food wherever it could. Their social life is harder to reconstruct. The larger brain suggests more complex social interactions. They may have had more sophisticated forms of communication than their ancestors, perhaps using a combination of gestures, body language, and a range of vocalizations. This would have been crucial for coordinating group activities like finding food or defending against predators. Within the group, there were likely strong bonds between individuals. The long period of childhood dependency, a consequence of having a large brain that needs time to grow and learn, meant that mothers would have needed help from others in the group to raise their offspring. This idea of cooperative breeding, where the whole group helps to care for the young, might have been a key part of their social structure. A typical day might have begun at sunrise. The group would awaken from their resting place, perhaps a grove of trees or a rocky outcrop that offered some protection. The first order of business would be finding water. Then the group would set out across the landscape, searching for food. Some individuals might focus on gathering plants, while others scanned the horizon for signs of predators or the circling of vultures that could indicate a nearby carcass. If they were lucky, they would find a source of meat. the group would work together with some standing guard while others used their sharp flakes to quickly butcher the animal. They would carry the most valuable pieces away to a safer place to be shared. The day would be spent in this constant rhythm of movement and foraging, punctuated by periods of rest in the shade during the hottest part of the day. As dusk approached, they would need to find a secure place to spend the night. The African night was filled with predators, and being caught in the open would be extremely dangerous. They had to be smart about where they chose to sleep. They lived in a world of constant, low-level stress and danger. They faced threats from predators, the risk of injury, and the constant challenge of finding enough food to fuel their large bodies and brains. Life was likely short and difficult, yet they did more than just survive. They thrived. Their populations grew and they spread throughout the African continent. They were a highly successful species, a master of the African savanna. They had a human-like body built for endurance, a brain capable of complex thought and problem-solving, and a technology, simple as it was, that gave them a critical edge. This was the creature that stood, around 1.9 million years ago, at the threshold of a great adventure. They had all the necessary ingredients to do something no creature like them had ever done before. They were ready to leave home. The stage was set, the actor was prepared, and the first great human story, the story of the journey out of Africa, was about to begin. They were not driven by a grand vision or a desire for conquest. They were simply living their lives generation after generation, pushing into new territories in a slow, relentless search for the resources they needed to survive. And this slow, undramatic spread would eventually take them to the very ends of the old world. Part 2. The driving forces. Why leave home? In our last part, we painted a detailed picture of our main character, Homo erectus, and the world they inhabited in Pleistocene Africa. We saw a creature with a human-like body built for long-distance walking, a brain significantly larger than its predecessors, and a simple but effective stone tool technology. They were a successful species, masters of the African savanna. But success can bring its own set of challenges, and it can lead to new opportunities. This brings us to the central question of this lecture, a question that is fundamental to the entire human story. Why did they leave? Why did this particular species, after millions of years of hominin evolution, confined entirely to the African continent, suddenly expand its range to cover 3 continents? The decision to leave one's home, to venture into the unknown, is one of the most significant choices any creature can make. But we must be careful with our words. It is highly unlikely that this was a conscious decision in the way we might think of it. There was no single individual or group that stood on a hill, looked north, and decided to go and see what was on the other side of the horizon for the sake of exploration. There was no grand plan, no organized expedition. The first great human migration was almost certainly not an event, but a process. It was a slow, creeping, multi-generational expansion that likely happened over thousands and thousands of years. It was so slow that no single individual would have been aware that it was even happening. A person born in one place would have lived their entire life within a certain territory, and they would have died there, but perhaps their children or their children's children would have set up their home territory just a few kilometers to the north, in an area that was previously unoccupied. If you repeat this process for 2,000 generations, you can cross an entire continent without anyone ever undertaking a journey of more than 20 or 30 kilometers from their birthplace. So the question is not why did they decide to leave Africa, but rather, what were the conditions and pressures that caused this slow, generational expansion to occur? To answer this, we need to look at a combination of factors, a perfect storm of circumstances that pushed them from behind and, in some ways, pulled them forward. We can group these driving forces into several key categories. environmental pressures, population dynamics, the unique biological traits of Homo erectus, and the ecological landscape they inhabited. There is no single correct answer, but by examining each of these forces in detail, we can build a comprehensive picture of how and why humanity first became a global species. Let us begin with the most powerful and relentless force of all, the environment. The world of the Pleistocene was not a stable one. As we discussed, it was a time of dramatic climate swings, of advancing and retreating ice sheets in the north that had profound effects on the climate of Africa. We need to look at this in more detail. The Earth's climate is influenced by long-term, predictable cycles in its orbit around the Sun. These are called Milankovitch cycles. They relate to the shape of the Earth's orbit, the tilt of its axis, and the wobble of its axis. These cycles unfold over tens of thousands of years, and they change the amount of solar radiation that different parts of the planet receive at different times of the year. During the Pleistocene, these cycles were the primary driver of the ice ages. When the cycles aligned to make the northern summers cooler, snow that fell in the winter would not melt completely. Year after year, the snow would accumulate, compacting into vast sheets of ice. When the cycles shifted to make the northern summers warmer, these ice sheets would melt and retreat. In Africa, the main effect of these cycles was on rainfall. When the world was in a cold, glacial period, much of the planet's water was locked up in ice. This made the global climate much more arid or dry. In Africa, this meant less rain. The great tropical forests, which need a lot of water, would shrink and retreat into isolated pockets. In their place, the open grasslands, the savannas, would expand dramatically. The Sahara Desert in the north would also expand, becoming an even more formidable barrier than it is today. Conversely, when the world entered a warm, interglacial period, the ice would melt and the climate would become much wetter. In Africa, this meant more rain. The forests would expand back out from their refuges, and the savannas would become lusher and greener. The deserts would shrink, and there is evidence of periods when the Sahara was actually a green, wet landscape with rivers and lakes. This constant pulsing between wet and dry conditions, between forest and savanna, between a green Sahara and a desert Sahara, had a profound impact on all life in Africa, including Homo erectus. This process is sometimes called the savanna pump. During dry periods, the expanding savanna would have pushed forest-dwelling animals into smaller and smaller areas, while allowing grassland animals to spread out. Homo erectus was a savanna specialist. Their long legs, their upright posture, which helped them see over tall grass and stay cool, and their diet, which included meat from savanna animals, all point to a creature perfectly at home in this open environment. So when the savanna expanded, their world expanded. Their preferred habitat, the place they knew how to survive in, was suddenly much, much larger. This expanding savanna did not just expand within Africa. During certain periods, this grassland corridor extended north up the Nile River Valley, across the Sinai Peninsula, and into the Middle East. It formed a continuous environmental highway, a familiar landscape that stretched from their home in East Africa all the way into Asia. For a creature like Homo erectus, moving along this corridor would not have felt like entering a strange new world. It would have felt like simply moving into a new part of their existing world. The plants were similar, the animals were similar, and the challenges were familiar. The savanna pump, therefore, did not just create pressure inside Africa, it also created an open door leading out of it. But the climate did more than just open a door. It also provided a powerful push from behind. During those long, intense, dry periods, life in Africa would have become much harder. Water would have been the most critical resource. As the rains failed, rivers would have shrunk, and lakes and waterholes would have dried up. The available water sources would have become fewer and farther between. This would have concentrated both hominins and other animals around the remaining water, leading to increased competition and increased risk from predators who were also drawn to the water. Plant foods would have also become scarcer. The lush vegetation would wither, and the edible roots and tubers they relied on would have been harder to find. The great herds of grazing animals, their primary source of meat, would have been forced to travel farther to find enough grass and water, or their numbers might have dwindled. Imagine a small group of Homo erectus living in a particular valley. For generations they have relied on a particular stream for water and a particular patch of woodland for plants. But now they are in the middle of a 10,000-year dry spell. The stream flows only intermittently. The woodland is shrinking and the animal herds are moving on. The carrying capacity of their home valley, the number of individuals it can sustainably support, is decreasing. The group is now facing a choice: stay and face starvation and thirst, or move. This is a powerful push. It is the most basic motivation of all: the search for food and water. They would have been forced to expand their foraging range, to walk a little farther each day. Eventually they might have been forced to abandon their valley altogether and move into the next one, hoping to find more reliable resources. This process, repeated all across the landscape by countless groups over thousands of years, would have created a general northward drift. The pressure was to move away from areas where resources were failing and towards areas where they might be more stable. The path of least resistance and the most familiar environment led northeast up the Rift Valley and towards the door out of Africa. The changing climate, therefore, acted as both a push and a pull. The push was the increasing scarcity and hardship in their homeland, and the pull was the expanding savanna corridor that offered a potential escape route to new lands with new resources. This leads us directly to our second major driving force: population dynamics. Even in a stable environment, a successful species will see its population grow. Homo erectus was very successful. Their larger brains and better tools allowed them to exploit their environment more effectively than their ancestors. They were better at finding food and likely better at avoiding predators. This would have led to lower mortality rates and a slow but steady increase in their numbers. Now, we are not talking about a population explosion like the one modern humans have experienced. Their population density would have been very, very low, perhaps comparable to that of grizzly bears in a wilderness area today. But even a tiny fractional percentage of growth each year adds up over thousands of generations. As a local group grew in size, it would eventually begin to press against the carrying capacity of its home territory. A particular stretch of river valley could only support so many people. There are only so many edible plants, so many animals to scavenge from, and so much clean water. When the population reached that limit, tensions would have started to rise. There would be more competition for food, more social stress. What happens then? Human foraging groups have a very common solution to this problem: they split. This process is called fission. A subgroup, often composed of related young adults, will bud off from the main group and move away to establish their own new territory. This is a key concept to understand. They were not migrating to a distant land, they were simply moving next door. Imagine a group of 30 individuals living in a territory of, say, 100 square kilometers. Over a few generations, their numbers grow to 40. The territory now feels crowded, food is a bit harder to find, so a small family unit of 5 or 6 people decides to move. They do not set off on an epic journey, they just move into the adjacent 100 square kilometer block of land, which happens to be empty. They are now just 10 kilometers away from their parent group. They still interact, they still share information, but they now have their own space and their own resources. Now, fast forward a few more generations, both of these groups have grown, and they both split again, each one budding off a new group into the next available empty territory. It is like the ripples spreading from a stone dropped in a pond. The water itself does not travel from the center to the edge. Each water molecule just moves up and down, bumping the one next to it, and this transfers the energy outwards. In the same way, no single Homo erectus individual traveled from East Africa to China, but the population, the species as a whole, spread outwards through this slow, relentless process of budding off into adjacent, empty territories. Each step was tiny, but the cumulative effect over millennia was enormous. This demographic push is a constant underlying pressure. It happens even when the climate is stable. But when you combine this natural tendency for populations to grow and split with the environmental pressures we just discussed, you get a much more powerful effect. During a dry period, the carrying capacity of the land decreases, meaning a group hits its resource limit sooner, and the pressure to split and move becomes much more intense. So climate change would have accelerated this natural process of demographic expansion. The engine was population growth, but the accelerator pedal was the changing climate. Neither of these pressures, environmental or demographic, would have led anywhere if Homo erectus had not been capable of making the journey. This brings us to our third set of driving forces, their own biology and behavior. As we established, Homo erectus was a revolutionary new kind of hominin. Their very bodies were built for dispersal. Their long legs, narrow hips, and arched feet made them incredibly efficient, long-distance walkers. They could cover vast distances over the savanna with a relatively low expenditure of energy. This is a critical pre-adaptation for a migrating species. An earlier short-legged Australopithecine would have found it much more energetically costly to move across a wide, open landscape day after day. Homo erectus, however, was born to walk. Their taller, more linear body shape was also an excellent adaptation for dealing with heat. In an open, equatorial environment, overheating is a serious risk, especially for a large-brained animal engaged in daytime activity. A tall, slender build provides a larger surface area relative to its volume, which allows heat to dissipate more effectively. They also had lost most of their body hair and were likely capable of sweating profusely, just like modern humans. This is a fantastically effective cooling system. It meant they could be active during the middle of the day, a time when many predators would be resting in the shade. This ability to travel and forage in the heat of the day without overheating gave them a huge advantage and opened up a whole new operational niche. It made them perfectly suited to the savanna, and it made them capable of sustained, day-after-day travel that was essential for expanding into new territories. Then there was their brain. The enlarged brain of Homo erectus was arguably their most important tool for migration. A bigger brain means greater cognitive flexibility. It means a better ability to learn, to remember, and to solve new problems. As groups moved into new areas, they would have faced unfamiliar challenges. The local predators might be different. The edible plants might be new species they had not seen before. The water sources might be hidden in different kinds of places. A creature that relies purely on instinct would struggle in a new environment. But Homo erectus could learn and adapt. They could create mental maps of their new territory, remembering the locations of important resources. They could experiment with new types of stone for their tools. They could observe the behavior of new animal species and figure out the best way to hunt or scavenge from them. This cognitive flexibility meant that they were not locked into a single, narrow habitat. They had the mental software to debug a new environment and figure out how to make a living in it. This adaptability is the hallmark of the human lineage, and Homo erectus was the first species to possess it to such a degree that it could support a global dispersal. Part of this cognitive package was their diet. Homo erectus was a supreme generalist. They were omnivores who could, and would eat almost anything. They ate roots, berries, nuts, and other plant foods. But they also had a significant amount of meat in their diet. This dietary breadth was a passport to the world. A dietary specialist, like a koala that only eats eucalyptus leaves, can only live where eucalyptus trees grow. But a generalist can find something to eat almost anywhere. If they moved into an area where their favorite type of root was not available, they could find another one. More importantly, their reliance on meat gave them a mobile food source to follow, which leads us to our final category of driving forces. The fourth force is ecological. We must picture Homo erectus not as an isolated creature, but as one part of a complex web of life on the African savanna. They were a predator, or at least a partial predator, and a scavenger. Their lives were intimately intertwined with the lives of the large herds of grazing animals that populated the plains. These herds of ancient wildebeest, giant buffalo, gazelles, and horses were not stationary. They were migratory, following the seasonal rains to find fresh grazing. The savanna ecosystem was a giant moving buffet. It is a very simple and powerful idea that the first human migration was not a migration of humans alone, but a migration of an entire ecosystem. As the climate changed and the savanna corridor opened up, connecting Africa to the Middle East, the grasslands expanded. And as the grasslands expanded, the grazers that ate the grass expanded their range as well. These herds of animals would have moved north, out of Africa, and into Asia, simply following their own food source. And following right along with them were their predators. This would have included the saber-toothed cats, the giant hyenas, and the lions. And it would have included Homo erectus. For a group of hominins who relied on these animals for a significant portion of their diet, simply following the herds would have been the most logical survival strategy. It was not a conscious decision to explore a new continent. It was a daily decision to follow the food. The herds move a few kilometers north today, so we move a few kilometers north. They continue north for the next week, and we continue to follow them. This process, carried out over generations, would have drawn them step by step out of Africa and into the vast open grasslands of Asia. The animals were the pull, the ecological magnet that drew Homo erectus out of their homeland. They were not pioneers striking out into an empty wilderness. They were part of a larger faunal expansion, one of many African animals that spread into Eurasia during this period. The difference is that Homo erectus had the intelligence and adaptability to stay and make a permanent home in these new lands, long after the initial environmental conditions that spurred the migration had changed. So when we ask the question, why did they leave, you see there is no simple answer. It was a complex interplay of all these factors, a cascade of causes and effects that unfolded over an immense span of time. You had the push of a changing climate, making their African homeland a harder place to live and creating resource stress. You had the push of their own demographic success, with slowly growing populations needing more space. You had the biological and cognitive toolkit that made them uniquely capable of long-distance travel and adaptation to new environments. Their bodies were built for walking, and their minds were built for problem-solving. And finally, you had the pull of the moving herds, a mobile food source that led them along the newly opened savanna highway right out of the continent. It was not one thing, but everything working together. A crisis creates the pressure to leave, an opportunity provides the direction, and the inherent capabilities of the creature make the journey possible. This was the moment in our history when the unique combination of human biology and ingenuity was first put to the test on a global scale. The result was the beginning of the human colonization of the planet, a process started not by us, Homo sapiens, but by our older, tougher, and arguably more successful ancestors, Homo erectus. They did not know they were making history, they were just trying to survive, to find food for themselves and their families. But in doing so, they laid the foundation for the entire human world that was to come. They took the first, most difficult step, and in doing so, they transformed a single African species into a global presence. Part 3, the first steps, the Levantine corridor and beyond. We have now established the powerful forces that were at play, the confluence of environmental pushes, demographic pressures, and biological capabilities that set the stage for the departure of Homo erectus from Africa. We understand the why. Now we must turn our attention to the how and the where. We must trace the path of those first tentative steps, the journey that took our ancient relatives out of their ancestral homeland and onto the world stage. This was not a voyage across a wide ocean or a trek over an impassable mountain range. The first step out of Africa was in many ways surprisingly subtle. It was a movement into a land that was, for all intents and purposes, simply an extension of the world they already knew. This journey was made possible by a land bridge, a corridor of life that connected Africa to Asia. This corridor is known as the Levantine corridor, and it was the gateway to the rest of the world. To understand this first leg of the journey, we must first erase the map of the modern world from our minds. We cannot think of the borders of Egypt, Israel, and Syria. We cannot picture the Suez Canal or the vast arid deserts that we see today. We must transport ourselves back to the early Pleistocene, nearly 2 million years ago, and see the world through the eyes of Homo erectus. The world looked different then. The climate, as we know, was in constant flux. During certain periods, particularly the wetter, warmer interglacials, North Africa was not the forbidding desert it often is today. The Sahara was greener, crisscrossed by ancient river systems and dotted with lakes. More importantly for our story, the entire northeastern corner of Africa was more lush and welcoming. The great Nile River, then as now, was a massive artery of life flowing north into the Mediterranean Sea. Its valley and its vast delta would have been incredibly rich environments teeming with plants, fish, birds, and large animals. For a foraging group of Homo erectus moving northward through the East African Rift Valley, following the Nile would have been a natural and easy path to follow. It was a reliable source of water and food, a blue line on a green map, leading them toward the edge of the continent. The edge of the African continent in the northeast is the Sinai Peninsula, the triangular piece of land that today connects Africa to Asia. Today, much of the Sinai is a harsh desert. But back then, during the periods when migration was most likely, it would have been different. It would have been part of that great savanna pump. It would have been a continuation of the African grasslands, a bridge of familiar territory. It would not have felt like leaving home. It would have felt like moving into the next valley over, a valley that just happened to be on what we, with our modern maps, would call a different continent. This land bridge, this savanna highway, is the Levantine corridor. The Levant is the name for the region at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. It includes the modern-day countries of Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. During the Pleistocene, this entire region formed a crucial geographic funnel. To the north were the Taurus Mountains in modern Turkey. To the east was the vast Arabian Desert. To the west was the Mediterranean Sea. Any animal, including hominins moving by land from Africa to Eurasia, had to pass through this narrow strip of land. It was the sole permanent land bridge. This corridor was not just a path, it was a destination in itself. It was a rich and varied landscape. The coastal plains along the Mediterranean would have been well watered and fertile. The Jordan Rift Valley, a northern extension of the same geological fault that created the Great Rift Valley in East Africa, would have contained large freshwater lakes and lush wetlands. The hills and mountains would have offered a variety of woodlands and open grassy areas. For a species like Homo erectus, which was highly adaptable, the Levant was not a difficult barrier to cross. It was a paradise of resources. It offered everything they were used to from their African home and more. There was fresh water in the lakes and rivers, abundant animals to hunt or scavenge, and a wide variety of edible plants. The idea of a difficult crossing is probably wrong. It was more like a slow, comfortable expansion into a new, rich territory that was directly connected to and environmentally similar to their old one. They simply walked, generation by generation, from Africa into Asia without ever realizing they had performed such a momentous act. So, how do we know this is the route they took? How do we find the evidence of a journey that happened almost 2 million years ago? The task for archaeologists is incredibly difficult. We are looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack that is 2 million years old and has been weathered by wind, rain, and geological change. The evidence we are looking for is primarily twofold: the stone tools that the hominins made and left behind, and the fossilized bones of the animals they ate, some of which might show the telltale cut marks from those tools. Finding the actual fossilized bones of the hominins themselves is extraordinarily rare. Hominins were not very numerous, and the specific conditions needed for a bone to fossilize are very uncommon. For every one hominin fossil we find thousands, or even tens of thousands, of their stone tools. Stone, after all, does not decay. A simple chopper made by a Homo erectus 2 million years ago can look almost the same today if it is found in the right geological context. So archaeologists search for ancient riverbeds, the shores of long-vanished lakes, and the floors of ancient caves, places where early humans might have camped and left behind the debris of their lives. For many years, the trail of evidence outside of Africa was cold. There were some scattered finds, but nothing definitive that could be securely dated to this very early period. But then, in the Jordan Rift Valley in Israel, a site was discovered that provided the first truly solid evidence of this ancient migration. The site is called Ubeidiya. It is one of the most important early human sites anywhere in the world outside of Africa. It provides a remarkable snapshot of the life and times of the first human pioneers who made their way into Asia. The site of Ubeidiya is located just south of the Sea of Galilee, in a part of the Jordan Rift Valley that is geologically very active. Over millions of years, the layers of the earth here have been tilted and pushed upwards, exposing very old sediments on the surface. It was here, in these ancient, tilted layers, that archaeologists began to find stone tools and fossilized animal bones. The process of dating the site was long and complex, using multiple techniques that looked at the magnetic properties of the rock layers and the types of extinct animal fossils found there. The consensus now is that the main archaeological layers at Ubeidiya are around 1.5 to 1.6 million years old. This date is incredibly important. It is not as old as the oldest Homo erectus fossils in Africa, but it is old enough to represent a very early stage of the dispersal out of the continent. It is a firm point on the map, a pin that says Homo erectus was here, outside of Africa, 1.5 million years ago. What exactly did they find at Ubeidiya? They found thousands upon thousands of artifacts and fossils buried in what used to be the muddy shoreline of a great Pleistocene lake. The environment at the time would have been a paradise for these hominins. Imagine a large, freshwater lake, fringed with reeds and marshes. In the distance, rolling hills covered in oak and olive trees with open grasslands in between. The area was teeming with wildlife. It was a rich, dynamic, and well-watered environment. It was, in many ways, very similar to the environments of the Great Rift Valley in Africa. This confirms the idea that they were not bravely conquering a new, alien world, but were simply expanding into a familiar and comfortable one. The stone tools found at Ubeidiya are fascinating. For the most part, they look very much like the Oldowan tools we discussed from Africa. There were simple choppers made by knocking a few flakes off a rounded river cobble to create a jagged, cutting edge. There were also numerous sharp flakes that would have been used for slicing and cutting. This tells us that these early pioneers brought their ancestral technology with them. They were using the same basic toolkit that their ancestors had been using in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. However, alongside these simple Oldowan tools, the excavators at Ubeidiya also found some tools that were slightly more sophisticated. These included crudely made pointed tools that seemed to be a very early form of what is known as the Acheulean hand axe. The Acheulean was a more advanced tool-making tradition, often associated with later Homo erectus, which involved shaping the entire stone into a symmetrical, bifacial tool. The presence of these proto-hand axes at Ubeidiya suggests that the site might represent a period of technological transition, a moment when the old way of making tools was beginning to give way to a new, more complex method. It is a hint that these hominins were not just surviving, but were also innovating. Even more informative than the tools were the animal bones. The site of Ubeidiya has yielded an enormous collection of fossilized animal bones, a veritable zoo of the Pleistocene. What is so remarkable about this collection is that it contains a mixture of Eurasian animals and animals of clear African origin. There were deer, horses, and rodents that were native to Eurasia. But alongside them, archaeologists found the bones of animals like a species of large hippopotamus, a type of saber-toothed cat, and various antelopes and giraffes that were clearly African immigrants. This is the smoking gun. It shows without a doubt that Ubeidiya was part of a major faunal exchange between the two continents. The animals were moving out of Africa along with the hominins. This confirms the ecological hypothesis we discussed in the last part. Homo erectus was part of a larger package of African species that expanded their range into Eurasia when the environmental conditions were right. They were following the herds, and Ubeidiya is the fossilized proof of that process in action. Many of these animal bones also show clear-cut marks from stone tools, direct evidence that the hominins were butchering these animals for their meat and marrow. What about the hominins themselves? Unfortunately, the fossil evidence for the toolmakers at Ubeidiya is very scarce. Only a few small fragments of hominin fossils have been found, including a single human tooth and a piece of a skull. While this is not much to go on, the tooth appears to be consistent with Homo erectus. The scarcity of hominin fossils is not surprising. As we said, they are always incredibly rare compared to the tools. But the tools and the context in which they were found leave no doubt. Ubeidiya was a campsite, a place on the shore of an ancient lake where groups of Homo erectus lived, made their tools, and butchered the animals they scavenged or hunted 1.5 million years ago. It is the oldest, well-documented rest stop we have found on that first great human journey. The Levantine corridor, evidenced so beautifully by Ubeidiya, remains by far the most widely accepted route for the first migration out of Africa. But was it the only one? Some researchers have proposed an alternative, a southern route. This hypothesis suggests that instead of walking out through the north, some groups may have crossed from the Horn of Africa, modern-day Ethiopia and Somalia, into the Arabian Peninsula. They would have crossed at the southern end of the Red Sea at a strait called the Bab el-Mandeb, which means Gate of Tears in Arabic. Today, this strait is about 30 kilometers wide, an impossible sea crossing for an early human who almost certainly could not build a boat or raft. However, during the coldest parts of the Pleistocene, the glacial maximums, so much of the world's water was locked up in the northern ice sheets that global sea levels were much, much lower, perhaps as much as 120 meters lower than they are today. With such a dramatic drop in sea level, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait would have been much narrower. It might have been just a few kilometers wide, perhaps with a few islands in between that could have been used as stepping stones. It is even possible, though unlikely, that it was a complete land bridge for very brief periods. So from a purely geographical standpoint, a crossing might have been possible during a few specific windows of time. The appeal of the southern route is that it provides a very direct path from the heart of hominin evolution in East Africa to the southern part of Asia, where some of the oldest Homo erectus fossils, like Java man, have been found. It seems like a more direct path than going all the way up through the Levant and then turning east. However, the southern route hypothesis suffers from one massive and so far fatal flaw, a profound lack of evidence. If hominins crossed into Arabia 1.8 or 1.9 million years ago, they would have had to survive there. They would have left behind their stone tools and the bones of the animals they ate. The Arabian Peninsula is a vast place, and much of it is now hyper-arid desert, making archaeological work very difficult. But despite decades of searching, archaeologists have not yet found any convincing, well-dated sites in southern Arabia that are anywhere near as old as the earliest sites in Africa, or the site of Ubaidiya in the Levant. There are some stone tools found on the surface, but their age is often impossible to determine. Without securely dated sites from this critical time period, the southern route remains a purely speculative idea. Furthermore, even with lower sea levels, the climate of the Arabian Peninsula during these glacial periods would likely have been extremely dry. It may not have been an attractive or even habitable environment for a species that was adapted to the wetter African savannas. The Levantine corridor, on the other hand, seems to have remained a relatively well-watered and resource-rich refuge even during drier periods. All the solid evidence we have points to the northern route. The Savannah Highway was open for business through the Levant, while the proposed southern gate seems to have been closed and barred by a harsh desert and a lack of convincing evidence. The scientific consensus, therefore, remains firmly with the Levantine corridor as the primary, and perhaps only, route for the first great human migration. Let us now take a moment to consider the challenges of this first leg of the journey, even along the welcoming path of the Levantine corridor. While the environment was familiar, it was not identical. As they moved north out of the equatorial zone, they would have experienced more pronounced seasons. For the first time, their lineage would have had to deal with a real winter. Perhaps not a winter with snow and ice at first, but a cooler, wetter season, where different food resources were available than in the summer. They would have had to adapt their foraging strategies, perhaps learning to store food or to rely on different types of plants and animals during different times of the year. This would have required a new level of planning and cognitive flexibility. They also would have encountered new geographical barriers. Even a resource-rich corridor has its obstacles. They would have had to learn how to cross rivers that were too deep to wade through. They would have had to navigate around mountain ranges or through dense, unfamiliar forests. Each new landscape would have presented a new set of problems to be solved. And while many of the animals were familiar African species, they would have also encountered new Eurasian animals, including new predators. They would have had to learn the habits of these new threats and develop strategies to avoid them. This first step, this movement from northeastern Africa into the Middle East, was a critical test. It was a test of their adaptability, their intelligence, and their resilience. The evidence from Ubaidiya shows that they passed this test. They successfully established a foothold in a new continent. They had walked out of Africa. They were now standing at the crossroads of the world, with the vast, unexplored continents of Asia and Europe stretching out before them. Their journey was far from over. In many ways, it had only just begun. The gate was open, and they had walked through it. The next question was, which way would they turn next? Part 4, the Dmanisi Enigma, a crossroads in the Caucasus. In our last part, we followed the first human pioneers as they took their initial steps out of Africa. We traced their path up the Nile, across a greener Sinai, and into the Levantine corridor, a rich land bridge connecting Africa to Asia. The archaeological site of Ubaidiya in Israel gave us a firm foothold, a snapshot in time of Homo erectus living successfully in a new land, using their familiar stone tools and hunting familiar African animals alongside new Eurasian ones. They had passed their first test. They were no longer just an African species, but once they were through that gateway, the world opened up. To the east lay the immense continent of Asia. To the northwest lay Europe. They were standing at a great crossroads. And it is here, at a place nobody expected, that the story takes a sudden and perplexing turn. It takes us to a site that has fundamentally rewritten our understanding of this first great migration. It has challenged our most basic ideas about who these first travelers were, what they were capable of, and what it took to colonize the world. We must now travel north from the Levant into the rugged Caucasus Mountains to a small promontory of land in the modern-day nation of Georgia. We are going to the incredible site of Dmanisi. The story of Dmanisi does not begin with a search for ancient humans. It begins with a medieval fortress. For centuries, the ruins of a fortified town sat on a bluff overlooking the confluence of two rivers. It was a place of historical interest, a reminder of the great kingdoms that once controlled the trade routes through the Caucasus. Archaeologists worked there for decades, excavating the remains of the old city. But beneath the medieval cellars and walls, they started to find something else, something much, much older. In the early 1980s, paleontologists working at the site began to uncover the fossilized bones of strange, extinct animals in the sediments under the fortress. They found the bones of ancient rhinoceroses, saber-toothed cats, primitive deer, and even a type of giant flightless ostrich. These animals were clearly from the Pleistocene epoch, the Ice Age. The discovery marked Dmanisi as an important paleontological site, a window into the ancient animal life of the region. But the story was about to become much more significant. The turning point came in 1991. A team of Georgian scientists led by David Lord Kipanidze was excavating these ancient animal bone beds. One day, a student on the team unearthed a piece of a jawbone. It was immediately clear that this was not from a deer or a pig. The shape of the jaw and the form of the teeth were unmistakably those of a hominin, a member of the human family. The discovery was electrifying but also deeply puzzling. The animal bones at the site had been dated to around 1.8 million years ago. At that time, in the early 1990s, the scientific consensus was that humans did not leave Africa until much later, perhaps only 1 million years ago. The conventional wisdom was that a hominin needed to evolve a larger brain and a more sophisticated technology, the Acheulean hand axe, before it would have been capable of surviving outside of the warm, familiar environment of Africa. A human jawbone in Georgia, this far north at this early date, simply should not have been there. It did not fit the story. Many scientists were skeptical at first. Perhaps the dating was wrong, perhaps the bone was not what it seemed. But the Georgian team continued their meticulous work. Then, in 1999, they made an even more stunning discovery. They found not just a jawbone, but two nearly complete hominin skulls. Now there could be no doubt. Early humans had been living in the Caucasus Mountains at the very dawn of the Pleistocene. The journey out of Africa was much older and much more complex than anyone had imagined. But Dmanisi was not finished giving up its secrets. Over the next few years, the team continued to find more hominin remains. They found another skull, then another. They found leg bones, arm bones, and parts of the spine. And then, in 2005, they found the most spectacular fossil of all, a fifth skull perfectly preserved, complete with its lower jaw. In total, the remains of at least 5 separate individuals were recovered from the same small area, all from the same slice of geological time. To understand the significance of this, we must appreciate how incredibly rare hominin fossils are. Finding a single, fragmented skull is the discovery of a lifetime for a paleoanthropologist. Finding 2 skulls together is almost unheard of. To find 5 skulls representing a single population of early humans who lived and died in the same place is a scientific treasure without parallel. It is like finding a family portrait from 1.8 million years ago. For the first time, we could look not just at a single representative of a species, but at the variation within a group. We could see how different they looked from one another, just as people in any modern family or community look different. The Dmanisi fossils provided a revolutionary new window into the biology and lives of the first human pioneers. So let us look closely at these individuals. What did this family portrait show us? It showed us a creature that was a strange mosaic of primitive and more advanced features. They were, in a word, confusing. Let's start with their bodies. The postcranial bones, the bones from below the skull, showed that they were walkers, just like their Homo erectus relatives in Africa. They had long, strong leg bones and a foot and ankle that were clearly adapted for long distance, efficient walking and running. Their spine was human-like, capable of supporting an upright posture. From the neck down, they looked like capable travelers who were well equipped for a life on the ground. But when we look at their skulls, the picture becomes much more complicated and much more interesting. All 5 of the Dmanisi skulls are small. Their brain sizes range from around 546 cubic centimeters to 730 cubic centimeters. Let's put that into context. The average brain size for a modern human is about 1,350 cubic centimeters. The average for a classic Homo erectus is around 900 or 1,000 cubic centimeters. The brains of the Dmanisi hominins were tiny. The smallest one, the famous Skull 5, had a brain volume of just 546 cubic centimeters. This is barely larger than the brain of a gorilla or an Australopithecine, our much earlier ape-like ancestors. It is well below the range previously thought possible for a member of the genus Homo. This was the first great shock of Dmanisi. The old theory said that humans needed to evolve a large brain to figure out how to leave Africa. But the Dmanisi fossils were proof that the first pioneers to reach the gates of Europe had brains that were in some cases not much bigger than those of the ancestors who never left. Their faces were also very primitive. Skull 5, the most complete individual, has a face that juts forward in a very ape-like way. It has a massive brow ridge and a very large upper jaw with big teeth. If you found only the face, you might not even classify it as a member of the genus Homo. It looked in many ways like an earlier, more primitive hominin like Homo habilis. Yet, this primitive face was attached to a brain case that, while small, had the characteristic long, low shape of Homo erectus. And these skulls were attached to bodies that were clearly capable of long-distance travel. It was a bizarre combination, a small-brained, primitive-faced creature with a modern, striding body. It was a creature that broke all the rules and defied all the existing categories. The variation among the 5 skulls was also astonishing. One of the skulls belongs to a young adolescent. Another, Skull 5, is likely a large, robust male. Another seems to be a more lightly built female. They show a range of sizes and shapes that, if found at different sites in Africa, would almost certainly have been assigned to different species. But at Dmanisi, they were all found together, living at the same time and in the same place. This strongly suggests they were all part of a single, variable population. They were all members of the same species. This leads us to one of the most profound debates sparked by the Dmanisi finds. What do we call them? Are they a very early, primitive form of Homo erectus? Or are they something else entirely? The discovery team initially suggested a new species name, Homo georgicus, to recognize their unique features. But the bigger question raised by the Dmanisi variation goes to the very heart of how we classify fossils. Paleoanthropologists are often called splitters or lumpers. Splitters tend to look at the differences between fossils and see distinct species. Lumpers tend to look at the similarities and group them together, seeing the differences as just normal variation within a species. The Dmanisi fossils are a lumper's dream and a splitter's nightmare. The research team at Dmanisi performed a groundbreaking analysis. They took their 5 skulls and measured the amount of variation between them. Then they compared this to the amount of variation you see within a population of modern humans and within a population of modern chimpanzees. They found that the range of variation among the 5 Dmanisi skulls was no greater than the variation you can find among 5 modern people or 5 modern chimps. Their conclusion was radical. They argued that all 5 individuals, despite their different appearances, comfortably fit within a single species. They chose to call this species Homo erectus, but they took their argument one giant step further. They suggested that if this much variation is normal for an early human population, then perhaps many of the other fossils we have found in Africa from the same time period are not different species after all. For decades, the story of early human evolution in Africa around 2 million years ago was one of diversity. There was thought to be Homo habilis, a small-brained toolmaker. There was Homo rudolfensis, a larger-brained contemporary. And then there was the emerging Homo erectus. The human family tree at this point was seen as a bushy, branching affair, with several different species of early humans living side by side. The Dmanisi team proposed a revolutionary alternative. What if Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and early Homo erectus are not different species at all? What if they are all just regional and individual variations of a single evolving lineage? What if they are all just Dmanisi-style Homo erectus? This would collapse that bushy tree into a single, straight trunk. It would imply that there was only one species of early Homo that emerged in Africa and then quickly spread across the globe. This is a huge controversial idea that is still being debated, but it shows the power of the Dmanisi discovery. That one small site in Georgia has forced us to question the very shape of our family tree. Beyond the question of who they were, Dmanisi also provides incredible clues about how they lived. One of the most compelling human stories from the entire fossil record comes from one of the Dmanisi individuals. This fossil consists of a skull and its matching lower jaw. It belonged to an old man. What is remarkable about this jaw is that it has no teeth. And it is not that the teeth just fell out after he died. The bone of the jaw has been resorbed. It has healed over the empty tooth sockets. This is a process that takes a long time, many years. This means that this old man lived for years without any functional teeth. Think about what this means for a hunter-gatherer living in the harsh world of the Pleistocene. He could not chew tough meat. He could not break open hard nuts or grind up fibrous plant roots. In the natural world, for a predator, the loss of teeth is a death sentence. A lion that cannot chew is a lion that will starve. Yet this individual survived for a long time. How was this possible? The only plausible explanation is that someone else in his group was helping him. They must have been finding food for him, and perhaps even processing it for him, chewing it up or pounding it into a soft pulp that he could swallow. This is an extraordinary piece of evidence. It suggests the presence of compassion, of social care, and of strong bonds within the group. It implies a complex social structure where the old and weak were not simply left behind, but were cared for. This small, toothless jaw from Dmanisi provides one of our first glimpses into the evolution of human kindness. It shows us that even these small-brained, primitive-looking people had a social life that was, in some fundamental way, recognizably human. The puzzles of Dmanisi do not end with the fossils themselves. We must also look at the environment they lived in and the tools they used. The evidence from the animal fossils and the plant pollen found at the site tells us that Dmanisi 1.8 million years ago was not an African savanna. It was a temperate environment, a mosaic of forests and grasslands. It had seasons. It would have had warm summers and cool, or even cold, winters. This is another major surprise. The first pioneers were not just following their familiar savanna environment out of Africa. They were able to adapt to a completely new type of ecosystem, one that was much cooler and more seasonal than their ancestral home. This speaks volumes about their cognitive flexibility and their resourcefulness. They were true pioneers capable of figuring out how to make a living in a world that was very different from the one they had evolved in. Perhaps the greatest puzzle of all lies in the stone tools they left behind. Archaeologists at Dmanisi have found thousands of stone tools scattered among the animal and hominin fossils. What is shocking is their simplicity. They are all classic Oldowan tools. They are simple flakes struck from a core and the leftover cores or choppers. There are no hand axes. There is no evidence of the more advanced Acheulean technology that was beginning to appear in Africa around this same time. This finding completely overturns the old theory of migration. The old idea was that hominins had to invent a better toolkit, the Acheulean hand axe, before they could successfully leave Africa and cope with the challenges of new environments. But the Dmanisi hominins did it with the simplest, most basic toolkit imaginable. They had small brains and simple tools. So what does this all mean? Dmanisi forces us to completely rethink the story of Out of Africa 1. It tells us that the first hominin to leave Africa was not a large-brained, technologically superior version of Homo erectus. Instead, it was a very primitive, small-brained creature with a toolkit no more advanced than that of its ancestors from 1 million years earlier. The requirements for leaving Africa were not a big brain and fancy tools. The key adaptations must have been something else. What could they be? Dmanisi points us toward the answers. First, a modern, striding body capable of efficient long-distance travel. They were built to walk, and they walked their way across continents. Second, a flexible, omnivorous diet that included meat. This allowed them to find food in almost any environment. Third, a complex social structure with a high degree of cooperation. The evidence of the toothless old man suggests that they looked after each other, and this social safety net would have been a huge advantage in a challenging new world. Dmanisi represents a critical crossroads, both geographically and scientifically. Geographically, it sits on the threshold between Asia and Europe, a staging ground for the further colonization of both continents. Scientifically, it sits at the crossroads of our understanding. It has forced us to discard old, simple theories and embrace a more complex and more interesting picture of our ancient past. It showed us that the first global citizens of the human family were not giants of intellect or technology. They were small, tough, adaptable social creatures who succeeded through their resilience, their cooperation, and their simple, relentless ability to just keep walking into the next valley, over the next hill, and eventually across the entire world. From this remarkable outpost in the Caucasus, the human journey would continue, pushing ever further into the unknown. Part 5. Eastward Bound, the journey into Asia. We have reached a pivotal moment in our story. We have followed the first human pioneers out of their African cradle through the gateway of the Levantine corridor. We have stood with them at the strange and unexpected outpost of Dmanisi in the Caucasus, a site that has completely reshaped our understanding of who these first travelers were. The Dmanisi fossils revealed a creature that was, by all previous measures, unprepared for such a journey. They had small, primitive brains and the simplest of stone tools. And yet they had succeeded. They had adapted to a new, temperate environment, and they possessed a social structure that hinted at a deep and recognizable humanity. Dmanisi was the proof that the key to this first global expansion was not necessarily a massive intellect or a sophisticated technology, but rather a combination of a body built for walking, a flexible diet, and the power of social cooperation. From this crossroads in the Caucasus, the human family was now poised to embark on the next great phase of its journey. The path now led east into the immense, diverse, and completely unknown continent of Asia. This next chapter is not the story of a single expedition or a planned campaign of exploration. We must once again imagine this process as a slow, inexorable creep across the landscape, a demographic wave spreading out over countless generations. A family would move into a new river valley, and their descendants a century later might move into the next one. This was not a race, it was a slow, steady process of settlement and expansion, a ripple spreading across the largest landmass on Earth. The continent of Asia would have presented this expanding population with a dizzying array of new challenges and new opportunities. It was a continent of extremes. There were vast, arid deserts that would have been almost impossible to cross. There were towering mountain ranges like the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau that formed colossal walls, barriers that would have channeled this human tide, forcing it to split and flow around them. And there were dense, tropical rainforests in the south, a type of environment they had never encountered before, filled with new foods, new predators, and new diseases. The journey into Asia was the ultimate test of the adaptability that Homo erectus possessed. Archaeologists believe that the expansion into Asia likely followed two broad pathways, dictated by the formidable geography of the continent. One stream of migration probably flowed south of the great Central Asian mountain ranges. This would have taken groups eastward from the Middle East, through what is now Iran and Afghanistan, into the vast and fertile Indian subcontinent. From there, the path would continue eastward into Southeast Asia. Another stream of migration may have gone north of the mountains, traversing the great open steppes of Central Asia, a vast sea of grass that at certain times would have been very similar to their ancestral African savanna. This northern route would have eventually led them into what is now China and the Far East. These were not mutually exclusive paths, and there was likely movement and mixing between them over many thousands of years. But they represent the two major corridors through which humanity first populated the Asian continent. To find the evidence of this ancient journey, we must follow the trail of fossils. And for the eastern expansion of Homo erectus, the story is defined by two iconic discoveries, two fossil personalities that have become legendary in the study of human evolution. One was found on a tropical island at the very southeastern edge of the world. The other was found in a cold, dusty cave system in the north of China. Together they provide the anchor points for our understanding of how Homo erectus conquered the East. We will begin our journey by following the southern route, a path that leads all the way to the island of Java in modern Indonesia, and to the discovery of a creature that, for a time, the world knew as Java Man. The story of Java Man is inseparable from the story of one man, a Dutch anatomist named Eugene Dubois. In the late 19th century, the scientific world was buzzing with Charles Darwin's new theory of evolution. Scientists were beginning to accept that humans had evolved from ape-like ancestors, and the hunt was on for the fossil evidence, for the so-called missing link that would connect apes and humans. Most scientists at the time were looking in Europe or Africa. But Dubois had a different idea. He looked at the modern apes, the chimpanzees and gorillas in Africa, and the orangutans in Southeast Asia. He reasoned that the cradle of humanity was likely in the tropics, and he became convinced that the true missing link would be found in Southeast Asia, in what was then the Dutch East Indies. His idea was considered radical, and he could not get any funding for an expedition. So, in a remarkable act of dedication, Dubois gave up his comfortable university position, enlisted in the Dutch Royal Army as a medical officer, and had himself posted to the East Indies. He was not going to be a soldier, he was using the army as a way to get to the place where he was certain he would find the ancestor of all humanity. After a few frustrating years searching on the island of Sumatra, Dubois moved his operations to the nearby island of Java. He began to focus his attention on the banks of the Solo River, where local workers were uncovering many ancient animal fossils. In 1891, his team of excavators made a discovery that would change the history of science. At a site called Trinil, they unearthed a fossilized skull cap. It was unlike anything seen before. It was long and low, with a very thick brow ridge, much more primitive than any known human skull. But its brain size, which Dubois estimated to be around 900 cubic centimeters, was much larger than that of an ape. It was something in between. A year later, just a few meters away from where the skull cap was found, the team discovered a fossilized femur, a thigh bone. This bone was the key. It was long, straight, and shaped in such a way that it could only have belonged to a creature that walked fully upright, on two legs, just like a modern human. Dubois knew he had found it. He had a primitive ape-like skull and a modern human-like leg bone. He named his discovery Pithecanthropus erectus, which means upright ape man. He had, in his mind, found the missing link, the perfect transitional fossil. He returned to Europe a hero, expecting to be celebrated. Instead, he was met with a storm of controversy and skepticism. The scientific establishment of the day was not ready for his discovery. Some argued that the skull cap was just from a strange, giant gibbon. Others argued it was from a deformed modern human. Many refused to believe that the primitive skull and the modern femur could possibly belong to the same creature. The debate was fierce and often personal. Dubois spent years defending his find, but the constant criticism took its toll. In a strange and tragic turn, he eventually became disillusioned, locked the fossils away from public view, and for a time even seemed to reject his own monumental discovery. History, however, has vindicated Eugene Dubois. In the 1930s, another scientist, Ralph von Koenigswald, went back to Java and began to find more fossils at different sites, most notably at a place called Sangiran. He found more skull caps, jawbones and teeth that were clearly from the same type of creature that Dubois had discovered. The new finds confirmed that Pithecanthropus erectus was real. It was a genuine species of ancient human that had lived in Java long ago. We now classify these fossils, along with many others, as Homo erectus. The Sangiran site is particularly important. It has produced dozens of hominin fossils and is now a World Heritage Site. It shows that Homo erectus lived in Java for a very long time. One of the most difficult and important questions about the Javan fossils is their age. How long ago did they live? The geology of Java is complex, full of volcanic layers that are difficult to date accurately. For many years, the oldest fossils were thought to be around 1 million years old. But more recent studies, using more advanced dating techniques, have pushed the dates back much further. Some of the oldest fossils from a site called Mojokerto may be as old as 1.5 or even 1.8 million years old. If these very early dates are correct, it is a staggering revelation. It would mean that Homo erectus spread from Africa across all of Asia and reached the far southeastern corner of the world in a very short amount of time. Geologically speaking, it would suggest that the first migration out of Africa was not a hesitant, tentative affair, but a rapid and incredibly successful expansion across a vast new world. The presence of Homo erectus in Java also tells us something about their abilities. During the Pleistocene, when sea levels were much lower, Java was not always an island. It was connected to the Asian mainland as part of a large landmass called Sunda. So for much of their history there, they could have simply walked to Java. However, there were likely periods when sea levels rose, and there would have still been significant water channels to cross to reach some of these islands. While there is no evidence that they built boats, it is possible they were able to cross narrow straits of water, perhaps by clinging to floating vegetation. More importantly, their survival in Java shows their incredible adaptability. They had moved from the open savannas of Africa into a dense, tropical island environment. The plants, the animals, and the climate were completely different. Yet they thrived. They successfully made this new, wet, forested world their home for over 1 million years. Java man, once a controversial and lonely fossil, is now recognized as a key representative of the easternmost branch of this first great human expansion. Now let us turn our attention to the north and to the other great icon of Asian paleoanthropology, Peking man. The story begins, strangely enough, in the pharmacies of China. For centuries, traditional Chinese medicine has used something called dragon bones. These were fossilized bones, ground up into a powder and used to treat a variety of ailments. In the early 20th century, Western scientists realized that these dragon bones were actually the fossils of extinct prehistoric animals. They began visiting Chinese pharmacies and searching for the places where these fossils were being dug up, hoping to find important paleontological sites. In the 1920s, a Swedish geologist named Johan Gunnar Andersson was working in China. He heard about a place called Chicken Bone Hill near the village of Zhoukoudian, just outside of what was then called Peking, modern-day Beijing. The locals were quarrying the limestone there, and in the process, they were finding many dragon bones. Anderson visited the site and realized that one of the old, collapsed cave systems in the hill was filled with fossil-rich sediment. He began a small excavation. A few years later, his assistant, an Austrian paleontologist named Otto Zansky, found 2 hominin-like teeth among the animal fossils. He was cautious about the discovery and did not announce it publicly for several years. The news, however, reached a Canadian anatomist working in Beijing named Davidson Black. Black was a brilliant and ambitious scientist, and he was convinced that the key to human evolution lay in Asia. When he finally saw Zdansky's teeth, he made one of the boldest moves in the history of science. Based on the evidence of just a single tooth, he declared the discovery of a new genus and species of ancient human, which he named Sinanthropus pekinensis, meaning Chinese man from Peking. It was a huge gamble. Creating a new species based on such minimal evidence was highly unorthodox, and many of his colleagues thought he was reckless. But Black was able to use his passion and his connections to secure major funding from the Rockefeller Foundation to begin a large-scale, systematic excavation of the Zhoukoudian cave system. The gamble paid off spectacularly. In 1929, a young Chinese paleontologist named Pei Wenzhong, who was leading the fieldwork, unearthed the first complete skullcap of Peking man. The discovery was a worldwide sensation. It vindicated Davidson Black and proved that a population of ancient humans had indeed lived in northern China. Over the next decade, the excavations at Zhoukoudian became one of the biggest scientific projects in the world. The team painstakingly dug through the thick layers of sediment in the cave, and their discoveries were astonishing. They found the remains of more than 40 individual hominins, including 5 more complete skullcaps, numerous jaw fragments, more than 150 teeth, and many limb bones. It was and remains one of the single richest collections of Homo erectus fossils ever found. These fossils gave us an incredibly detailed picture of what this northern population of Homo erectus was like. They were very similar in overall shape to Java man, with the same long, low skull, thick brow ridge, and a brain size that was on average a little larger, around 1,000 to 1,100 cubic centimeters. The cave also yielded tens of thousands of simple stone tools. Just like at Dmanisi, and just like in the earliest toolkits from Africa, they were simple choppers and flakes made from poor quality quartz. There were no finely crafted hand axes. And alongside the hominin fossils and tools were the remains of thousands of animals, particularly a species of large extinct deer. Many of these animal bones were broken and burned, suggesting that the inhabitants of the cave were hunting these animals and cooking their meat. The most famous claim made about Zhoukoudian was that it contained the first definitive evidence for the controlled use of fire by early humans. The excavators reported thick layers of ash within the cave, which they interpreted as ancient hearths, campfires that had burned for generations. For decades, the image of Peking man huddled around a fire in his cold, dark cave became the classic picture of life for Homo erectus. This picture may not be entirely accurate. More recent re-examinations of the Zhoukoudian evidence have cast doubt on the controlled use of fire. Some scientists argue that the ash layers might actually be naturally deposited layers of organic sediment. They also point out that the burned bones could have been the result of natural wildfires. The debate is still ongoing, but it is a reminder that our interpretations of the past can change as we develop new scientific methods. Whether or not they had controlled fire, the people of Zhoukoudian were clearly survivors. They lived in a harsh, temperate environment with cold, icy winters, a world away from the tropical warmth of Java or the mild savannas of Africa. The story of the Peking man fossils has a final tragic chapter. By the late 1930s, Japan had invaded China and the war was getting closer to Beijing. The scientists at Zhoukoudian grew concerned for the safety of the priceless fossils. In 1941, they decided to ship the entire collection to the United States for safekeeping until the war was over. The fossils were carefully packed into 2 large wooden crates and were taken to a US Marine base to be transported by ship. But somewhere in the chaos of the war, in the days surrounding the attack on Pearl Harbor, the crates vanished. To this day, nobody knows for sure what happened to them. Were they on a ship that was sunk? Were they captured and hidden by Japanese soldiers? Or were they simply lost, dumped, or destroyed in the confusion? The original Peking man fossils have never been seen again. It is one of the greatest losses in the history of science. Fortunately, a brilliant anatomist named Franz Weidenreich had made incredibly detailed and accurate casts, drawings and descriptions of all the fossils before they were lost. It is only because of his meticulous work that we still know so much about the people of the Zhoukoudian cave. The discoveries in Java and China confirmed that Homo erectus had successfully colonized the entire length and breadth of Asia, from the tropical islands of the south to the cold plains of the north. But these discoveries also created a deep and lasting mystery. The tools found in Java, in China, and at other sites across East Asia were all simple Oldowan-style choppers and flakes. But back in Africa, in Europe, and in the Middle East, Homo erectus populations had by this time developed a much more sophisticated technology, the Acheulean hand axe. This beautiful, symmetrical, teardrop-shaped tool was a significant technological advance. Yet for some reason, it never seemed to make it to East Asia. In the 1940s, a Harvard archaeologist named Hallam Movius drew a line on a map of the Old World. The line ran across northern India. To the west of the line, you found hand axes. To the east of the line, you did not. This became known as the Movius Line, and it represents one of the great technological divides in human history. Why did this divide exist? For over 1 million years, hominins in the West made one type of tool, while their cousins in the East made another. The earliest and most simplistic explanation, which is now completely rejected, was that the eastern populations were simply less intelligent or more culturally conservative. This idea is not supported by the fossils, which show that brain size increased in Asian Homo erectus just as it did in Africa. So, scientists have proposed several more plausible hypotheses. One is the early departure hypothesis. Perhaps the groups that first populated Asia left Africa before the hand axe was even invented there, around 1.76 million years ago. They left with only the knowledge of how to make Oldowan tools. Once in Asia, they were so successful and their populations were so spread out that the new idea of the hand axe never reached them. The evidence from Dmanisi, with its very early date and simple tools, strongly supports this idea. Another possibility is that the raw materials were different. To make a good hand axe, you need a large, fine-grained cobble of stone, like flint or chert. It is possible that in many parts of East Asia, this type of high-quality stone was rare. Instead, they had to rely on small, difficult-to-work materials like quartz. You simply cannot make a large, elegant hand axe out of a small quartz pebble, so their technology might have been limited by the local geology. Perhaps the most intriguing idea is what is known as the bamboo hypothesis. Large parts of East and Southeast Asia are rich in bamboo. Bamboo is a remarkable resource. It is strong, flexible, and grows very quickly. With a few simple stone flakes to cut and shape it, you can make an enormous variety of highly effective tools from bamboo. You can make razor-sharp knives, deadly spear points, containers for food, and water and materials for building shelters. The argument is that Homo erectus in Asia did not need to invest the time and energy into making fancy stone hand axes because they had a sophisticated and versatile toolkit made of bamboo. Their simple stone tools were not their primary technology. They were just the tools used to create their more important bamboo tools. Of course, bamboo is an organic material that rots away and does not fossilize. This means we have no direct archaeological evidence to support this idea. It is a compelling and elegant explanation, but for now it must remain a clever speculation. It is likely that the truth behind the Mobius line is a combination of all these factors. The ancestors of Java man and Peking man probably did leave Africa before the hand axe was invented. They then adapted to their new environments where high-quality stone was scarce and other materials like bamboo were abundant. They were not less intelligent. They were simply solving the problems of survival with a different set of solutions, a different technological path. The journey into Asia was a resounding success. Homo erectus proved that the human family was no longer tied to one continent or one type of environment. They had the resilience and the ingenuity to make a home for themselves in the tropical forests of the south, the cold plains of the north, and everywhere in between. They had conquered the east, but there was still one more continent left to explore. The next part of our story will turn west, to the challenging and long unsettled continent of Europe. Part 6. Life in a New World, Adaptation and Survival. We have charted the great eastward expansion of Homo erectus, following their trail from the Caucasus crossroads to the tropical island of Java and the cold caves of northern China. We have seen how this species, with its simple tools and primitive brains, successfully populated the largest continent on Earth. But in charting this journey, we have focused primarily on the where and the when. We have looked at the fossil sites and the dates, the pins on the map that mark their progress. Now we must pause our journey across the globe and delve deeper into a more fundamental question. How? How did they actually do it? What was daily life like for these pioneers in a world so different from their African homeland? How did they find food? How did they cope with new climates? And how did they survive the myriad new dangers of Eurasia? This part of our lecture is not about the path of migration, but about the challenges of adaptation. It is about the gritty, day-to-day business of staying alive in a new world. The foundation of survival for any animal, including an early human, is getting enough to eat. The diet of Homo erectus was the key to their success. They were supreme generalists, omnivores, who could make a meal out of a vast range of resources. This dietary flexibility, honed on the unpredictable savannas of Africa, was their greatest asset as they moved into new continents. In Africa, they ate a mix of savanna grasses, roots, tubers, and the meat from large grazing animals. But as they moved into the temperate woodlands of the Levant, or the tropical forests of Java, the menu changed completely. The old familiar plants were gone, replaced by new species with different properties. The herds of wildebeest and gazelle were replaced by deer, wild boar, and ancient forms of elephants and rhinoceroses. For a dietary specialist, this would have been a disaster. For Homo erectus, it was just a new set of problems to be solved. How do we know what they ate? Archaeologists use several lines of evidence to reconstruct the diet of these ancient people. The most direct evidence comes from the archaeological sites themselves, the places where they camped and ate their meals. These sites are often littered with the fossilized bones of the animals they consumed. At Zhoukoudian in China, for example, the cave floor was a thick layer of discarded animal bones, dominated by a species of large, thick-jawed deer. At other sites in Europe, we find the bones of horses, bison, and even giant elephants. These bone assemblages are not just random collections, they often show a clear pattern. The bones are frequently broken open in a very specific way, smashed to get at the nutritious marrow inside. This is a classic signature of human activity. Furthermore, if you look at these bones under a microscope, you can sometimes see the tiny, linear scratches left behind by their stone tools. These cut marks, found at the points where a muscle would have attached to a bone, are the smoking gun. They are direct proof that a hominin was using a sharp stone flake to slice meat off the bone. These animal bones tell us that meat was a very important part of their diet. The ability to acquire and process large animal carcasses was a game changer for human evolution, and it was a critical component of their survival strategy in new lands. Meat and marrow are incredibly dense sources of calories, protein, and fat. In colder, northern climates, where edible plants might be scarce or completely unavailable during the long winter months, access to meat would have been the difference between life and death. It was a reliable, year-round source of high-quality energy. This raises the old question again: were they mighty hunters or clever scavengers? The answer is almost certainly both, and it probably varied from place to place. In some environments, scavenging the kills of large predators like saber-toothed cats might have been a viable strategy. In others, they may have been more active hunters. It is easy to imagine them as heroic big-game hunters, but we must be realistic about their technology. They did not have bows and arrows or high-powered rifles. Their primary hunting weapons would have been very simple: sharpened wooden spears and rocks that they could throw. A wooden spear, its tip hardened in a fire, could be a formidable weapon at close range, but using it to bring down a giant buffalo or woolly rhinoceros would have been an incredibly dangerous and difficult task. It is more likely that their hunting focused on a strategy of smart hunting. They would have used their intelligence to exploit the weaknesses of their prey. They might have targeted younger, older, or sick animals that were easier to kill. They might have worked cooperatively to drive a herd of animals off a cliff or into a muddy bog, where they would become trapped and helpless. They would have been ambush predators using their knowledge of the landscape to get close to their prey without being detected. They were not the fastest or the strongest predators on the landscape, but they were the smartest. Of course, their diet was not all meat. Plant foods would have remained a crucial part of what they ate, especially in warmer climates where they were available year-round. Unfortunately, plant remains do not preserve well in the archaeological record, so this part of their diet is much harder to reconstruct. We can get clues by looking at the types of environments they lived in and inferring the types of edible plants that would have been available. They would have gathered fruits, nuts, seeds, and leafy greens. A particularly important resource would have been underground storage organs, things like tubers and roots. These are like the potatoes and carrots of the prehistoric world. They are often available year-round, and they are a great source of carbohydrates. Finding and extracting these underground resources would have required knowledge and specialized tools. They would have needed digging sticks, simple sharpened branches to break up the hard ground. The knowledge of which plants were edible, which were poisonous, and where to find them would have been a vast and complex body of information passed down from generation to generation. This botanical knowledge was just as important as the skill of making a stone tool. The tools themselves were, of course, central to their ability to adapt their diet. As we have seen, the Homo erectus toolkit was, for the most part, remarkably simple. In the East, it was the Oldowan-style chopper and flake. In the West, it eventually included the Acheulean hand axe. These simple tools were like a prehistoric Swiss army knife. The sharp flakes were the cutting blades used for everything from butchering an elephant to sharpening a spear or peeling a tough root. The heavy choppers and hand axes were the heavy-duty tools used for smashing bones, chopping wood, or digging. The genius of this technology was not its complexity but its flexibility. With a good piece of stone, a Homo erectus could quickly manufacture a whole set of tools to solve the problem at hand. If they needed a sharp knife, they could make one in seconds. If that knife got dull, they could throw it away and make another one. It was a disposable, adaptable, and highly effective technology. We also have to consider the invisible toolkit. As we discussed with the Movius line, it is very likely that they made and used a huge variety of tools from organic materials like wood, bone, and bamboo. A sharpened wooden spear is a far more effective hunting weapon than a handheld rock. A basket woven from plant fibers would have been essential for gathering and transporting plant foods. A container made from an animal hide or a large gourd could have been used to carry water, a critical advantage in a dry landscape. A simple bone point could be used as a needle for piercing hides. None of these things would survive in the archaeological record for 2 million years, but we can be almost certain they existed. The simple stone tools we find are likely just the tip of the iceberg, the durable remnants of a much richer and more complex technological world. Their survival was not just about stone, it was about their ability to turn wood, bone, and plants into the objects they needed to make a living. Beyond finding food, one of the greatest challenges they faced as they moved out of equatorial Africa was adapting to new climates. Homo erectus was a tropical species evolved under the African sun. Their tall, linear bodies were perfectly adapted for dissipating heat. But as they moved north into Asia and Europe, they encountered a world that was often much, much colder. For the first time in human history, our ancestors had to deal with freezing temperatures, snow, and long, dark winters where food was scarce. This was a monumental adaptive challenge, and it would have required a whole new set of biological and cultural solutions. There is some debate about whether their bodies changed in response to the cold. In modern humans, populations that have lived in cold climates for a long time, like the Inuit, have evolved a characteristic body shape. They tend to be shorter and stockier with shorter limbs. This body shape has a lower surface area to volume ratio, which is better for conserving heat. It is the opposite of the tall, slender build of people from hot, dry climates. Some of the later Homo erectus fossils from colder regions like China do seem to be a bit more robust and stocky than their earlier African ancestors, which might be a sign of this kind of biological adaptation beginning to take place. But biology changes slowly over many generations. The more immediate solutions to the problem of cold would have to have been cultural and behavioral. The most basic behavioral adaptation is to find shelter. Caves and rock shelters would have been prime real estate in the Pleistocene. A cave provides a natural defense against the wind, the rain, and the snow. It offers a secure place to sleep, protected from predators. The Zhoukoudian site is a perfect example of this. It was a cave that was used by generations of hominins, a permanent base of operations in a harsh landscape. Where natural caves were not available, they would have had to create their own shelters. We have no direct evidence of what these shelters looked like, but it is plausible that they could have built simple structures from branches, perhaps covered with animal hides or large leaves. A simple windbreak built against a rock wall could provide a significant amount of protection from a freezing wind. The most revolutionary adaptation to the cold would have been the control of fire. Fire provides three things that are essential for survival in a cold climate: warmth, light, and protection. A campfire can keep a group warm through a freezing night. It extends the usable part of the day, providing light to work and socialize after the sun goes down. It is also a powerful deterrent against predators. Most animals are naturally afraid of fire, and a ring of campfires around a sleeping site would have been an effective fence against saber-toothed cats and cave bears. Fire is also a powerful tool for cooking. Cooking food has several major advantages. It kills bacteria and parasites, making food safer to eat. It also breaks down tough fibers and complex carbohydrates, making the food easier to chew and digest. This means the body can get more energy out of the same amount of food. Some scientists, like the anthropologist Richard Wrangham, have argued that the invention of cooking was one of the most important events in human evolution. The extra energy gained from cooked food, he argues, is what allowed our brains to grow so large. So, when did Homo erectus learn to control fire? This is one of the most hotly debated topics in paleoanthropology. For many years, the thick ash layers at Zhoukoudian in China, dated to around 700,000 years ago, were considered the oldest definitive evidence. As we discussed, that evidence has been questioned, but in recent years new evidence has emerged from other sites. At a site in Israel called Gesher Benot Yaakov, dated to nearly 800,000 years ago, archaeologists have found clusters of burned flint artifacts. The burning appears to be concentrated in specific spots as if in a hearth, and not randomly scattered as you would expect from a natural wildfire. This is currently some of the strongest evidence for the controlled use of fire. There are even more tentative claims from sites in South Africa that are over 1 million years old. The picture that is emerging is that the use of fire was likely a long, slow process of discovery and innovation. Early hominins might have first learned to opportunistically use fire from natural sources like lightning strikes or volcanic eruptions. They might have learned how to keep a natural fire going, tending it and carrying embers with them as they moved. The final step, learning how to create fire at will by striking rocks together or using a friction drill, was probably a much later invention. By the time Homo erectus was living in the cold northern climates of China and Europe, it seems very likely that they had at least some level of control over fire. It is hard to imagine how they could have survived the winters without it. The campfire would have become the center of their social world, a place to share food, find safety, and communicate. The hearth became the first home. Finally, we must consider the social adaptations. Homo erectus did not conquer the world as a collection of rugged individuals. They did it as members of highly cooperative social groups. We saw the evidence for this in the toothless old man from Dmanisi, who must have been cared for by his companions. This social safety net was a profound advantage. In a small foraging group, every individual is valuable. The loss of an experienced adult is not just a personal tragedy, it is a loss of knowledge and skills that could endanger the entire group. By caring for the sick and injured, they were preserving the social fabric and the collective knowledge of their community. This cooperation would have extended to all aspects of their lives. They would have worked together to find food, with some individuals hunting while others gathered plants. The food that was acquired would then be brought back to a home base and shared among the group. This is a very human pattern of behavior, and it is different from many other primates. Food sharing ensures that everyone gets something to eat, even on a day when they were not personally successful in finding food. It is a form of social insurance. Cooperation was also essential for raising children. A human child has a very long period of dependency. They are helpless for many years and require a huge investment of time and energy. It is very difficult for a single mother to provide for herself and a dependent child. In a cooperative group, other members of the community, such as fathers, grandmothers, and siblings, can all help with childcare and providing food. This system, known as cooperative breeding, would have allowed them to raise more children successfully, fueling the population growth that drove their expansion. Their social lives were likely rich and complex. They would have had to communicate with each other about the location of food, the presence of predators, and the plans for the day's activities. While it is unlikely they had a complex symbolic language like our own, they almost certainly had a sophisticated system of communication involving gestures, body language, and a range of vocal calls. Living in a group also requires a complex social intelligence. You have to be able to keep track of who is related to who is an ally, and who is a rival. You need to be able to understand the motivations and intentions of others. The need to navigate this complex social world may have been one of the primary driving forces behind the evolution of their large brains. In this new world outside of Africa, Homo erectus was a creature in transition. They were still very much a part of the natural world, their lives dictated by the seasons and the availability of resources. They were just one of many predators on the landscape, and they were also prey. But they were something new as well. They were an animal that was beginning to create its own world, its own niche. Through the power of culture, they used their intelligence to create technology to control fire and to build complex social networks. This growing reliance on cultural adaptation, rather than just biological adaptation, was the secret to their success. It is what allowed them to break free from the constraints of their ancestral environment and make a home for themselves in virtually any corner of the old world. They were the first truly global human species, and they achieved this not because they were the strongest or the fastest, but because they were the most adaptable, the most cooperative, and the most resourceful creatures the world had ever seen. Part 7. The European Question, a Late Arrival. We have now traced the incredible journey of Homo erectus across the vast continent of Asia, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the tropical islands of Indonesia and the frozen plains of northern China. The evidence from Dmanisi in Georgia to the sites of Java and Zhoukoudian shows a species that was dynamic, adaptable, and incredibly successful. Their expansion eastward seems to have been relatively rapid, a wave of humanity that swept across the continent in a geological blink of an eye. The oldest dates for their presence in Asia now push back to 1.8 million years ago, very shortly after they first emerged in Africa. But this picture of rapid, successful colonization raises a profound and puzzling question. If they could so quickly and effectively populate all of Asia, what about the continent that lay just to the west of their Dmanisi outpost? What about Europe? For many years, the story of human evolution was very Eurocentric. The first recognized fossil humans, the Neanderthals, were found in Europe. The beautiful cave art of the Upper Paleolithic was a European phenomenon. For a long time, it was simply assumed that Europe was a central stage for the human story from the very beginning. But as our knowledge of the fossil record has grown, a very different picture has emerged. It turns out that, compared to Africa and Asia, Europe was a latecomer to the party. It was the last of the 3 Old World continents to be permanently settled by humans. While Homo erectus was thriving in China and Java well over 1 million years ago, The evidence for a significant and continuous human presence in Europe at that same time is scarce, controversial, and often frustratingly ambiguous. Europe appears to have been a much harder nut to crack. This is the great European question. Why the delay? Why did it take so long for our ancestors to make a permanent home in the continent that lay right on their doorstep? To answer this question, we must first consider the unique environmental challenges that Europe presented. While Asia offered vast open corridors of savanna and steppe that were a continuation of the African environment, Europe was a different beast. Geographically, it is a much more fragmented continent. It is a peninsula of peninsulas, broken up by mountain ranges like the Alps, the Pyrenees, and the Carpathians. These mountains would not have been impassable barriers, but they would have made movement more difficult and would have isolated different regions from one another. This fragmentation would have made it harder for populations to expand smoothly across the landscape. The more significant barrier, however, was the climate. Being situated farther north than most of Africa and southern Asia, Europe was much more profoundly affected by the Pleistocene ice ages. During the cold glacial periods, vast sheets of ice, kilometers thick, covered most of northern Europe, including all of Scandinavia and Britain. The land just south of these ice sheets was not a pleasant place to live. It was a cold, wind-swept landscape of tundra and polar desert, with very short, cool summers and brutally long, dark and cold winters. Even around the Mediterranean, which remained unglaciated, the climate would have been much cooler and drier than it is today. These glacial periods would have made much of Europe simply uninhabitable for a species that had evolved in the tropics and was still in the process of adapting to colder climates. Then, during the warmer interglacial periods, the ice would retreat and the climate would become much more temperate and pleasant, sometimes even warmer than it is today. Forests would spread back across the continent and animal life would flourish. It was during these warmer windows of opportunity that hominins would have been able to push into Europe. But these warm periods were not permanent. The climate cycles were relentless. A warm period might last for 10 or 20,000 years, long enough for a small population of hominins to establish a foothold. But then, inevitably, the climate would begin to cool again. The glaciers would start to advance from the north, the forests would die back, and the winters would become harsher. A hominin population that was adapted to a warm, forested Europe would suddenly find itself in a cold, hostile world. They would have been faced with a stark choice: retreat south, adapt to the new, harsh conditions, or go extinct. This cyclical nature of the European climate, this constant opening and closing of the environmental door, is likely the main reason for the delayed and patchy settlement of the continent. Europe may not have been settled in a single, continuous wave, but rather in a series of pulses. Hominins may have expanded into Europe during a warm interglacial, survived for a few thousand generations, and then been wiped out or forced to retreat when the next ice age descended. Europe may have been a revolving door of settlement and extinction for hundreds of thousands of years. It was only much later that a human population, the Neanderthals, would evolve the specific biological and cultural adaptations needed to survive and thrive in the harsh reality of glacial Europe year-round. So, with this challenging backdrop in mind, let us look at the evidence. Where and when do we find the first traces of these European pioneers? The search for the earliest Europeans has been a long and often contentious one. It is a field littered with disputed claims, ambiguous artifacts, and fossils of uncertain age. For many years, the oldest accepted sites in Europe were no more than about 500,000 years old. Anything older was viewed with extreme skepticism. But in the last few decades, a handful of sites have emerged, particularly in the southern parts of the continent, that have pushed the timeline back, closer to the 1 million year mark and perhaps even earlier. The most important of these sites, and the one that provides the most spectacular and undeniable evidence for an early human presence in Europe, is the incredible complex of sites at Atapuerca in northern Spain. The Sierra de Atapuerca is a low range of hills. In the late 19th century, a railway line was cut through these hills, creating a deep trench that sliced through a series of ancient, fossil-filled caves that had been sealed for hundreds of thousands of years. It was like a geological scalpel had laid open a perfect cross-section of the deep past. For decades, the site was known only to local fossil hunters. But beginning in the 1970s, a team of Spanish scientists began a systematic excavation of these caves, and what they have found there has revolutionized our understanding of European prehistory. The Atapuerca complex contains several different sites of different ages. We will talk about the younger and more famous Pit of Bones site, which is associated with the ancestors of the Neanderthals in a later context. For our story of the first arrivals, we need to focus on two of the oldest sites in the trench, Gran Dolina and Cima del Elefante, the Pit of the Elephant. Let's start with Gran Dolina. In the 1990s, while excavating a deep layer of the cave's sediment known as TD6, the team found something extraordinary. They found simple Alderaan-style stone tools, the bones of butchered animals, and, most importantly, the fossilized remains of several hominin individuals. These fossils included teeth, jaw fragments, and pieces of the skull. The geological layer in which they were found was dated to around 800,000 years ago. At the time, this was by far the oldest credible evidence for humans in Europe. The fossils themselves were a puzzle. They were not quite like the classic Homo erectus from Asia, and they were not like the later Neanderthals. They had a unique combination of features, some primitive and some more modern. The Spanish team decided that they represented a new species, which they named Homo antecessor, meaning pioneer man or explorer man. They proposed that Homo antecessor was the common ancestor of both later Neanderthals in Europe and modern humans, Homo sapiens, in Africa. This is a very bold claim and is still a subject of intense debate. Other scientists believe that the fossils are more likely a European variant of Homo erectus, or perhaps an early member of another species called Homo heidelbergensis. Whatever we call them, the Gran Dolina fossils were undeniable proof that a population of hominins was living in Spain, hunting and butchering animals almost 1 million years ago. One of the most chilling discoveries from the Gran Dolina site was that some of the hominin bones, as well as the animal bones, showed clear-cut marks from stone tools. The bones had been systematically butchered and broken open for marrow in exactly the same way as the deer and bison bones. This is the oldest solid evidence for cannibalism in the human fossil record. We do not know why they were doing this. It could have been for ritual purposes, or it could have been a more practical matter of survival in a harsh environment. Whatever the reason, it gives us a stark and unsettling glimpse into the lives of these first Europeans. But the story of Atapuerca gets even older. Just a short distance away in the same railway trench is another cave, Cima del Elefante. Here, the excavators dug even deeper into older layers of sediment, and in 2007 they made a discovery that pushed the story back even further. In a layer dated to an astonishing 1.2 million years ago, they found a single hominin jawbone fragment, a few teeth, and a simple stone flake. This is currently the oldest accepted hominin fossil in all of Western Europe, 1.2 million years ago. This discovery proved that hominins had reached the far western edge of the European continent at a much earlier date than previously thought. The jawbone is too fragmentary to assign to a definite species, but it shows some similarities to the ancient hominins from Dmanisi. This has led to the compelling idea that the first colonization of Europe was an extension of the same early dispersal event that we see at Dmanisi. It is possible that after reaching the Caucasus, some groups turned east into Asia, while others turned west and, following the northern shore of the Mediterranean, eventually made their way into the Iberian Peninsula. The evidence from Atapuerca is solid, but what about the rest of Europe? The picture is much murkier. There are a few other sites that may be of a similar great age. In southern Italy, at a site called Pirro Nord, archaeologists have found stone tools that could be over 1 million years old, although no hominin fossils have been found with them. In France, at sites like Lézignan-la-Cèbe, there are also tools that may be of a similar age. All of these very early sites are in the south of Europe, in the warmer Mediterranean region. This makes sense. These areas would have served as refuges, places where hominin populations could survive even during the colder glacial periods. The harsher, colder northern parts of Europe seem to have remained empty of humans for much longer. The identity of these very first Europeans is a major unresolved question. Were they an expansion of the Dmanisi population, a primitive form of Homo erectus? Were they the species we call Homo antecessor? Or were they part of a different migration out of Africa altogether? One intriguing piece of the puzzle comes from a site called Ceprano in Italy. Here, in the 1990s, a single, fragmented but fairly complete hominin skullcap was found. The dating of the site has been very difficult and controversial, but some studies suggest it could be around 800,000 or 900,000 years old. The skull itself is robust with a large brow ridge, and in some ways it looks like a classic Homo erectus. But it also has some features that are more advanced. Its brain size is larger, over 1,000 cubic centimeters. Some researchers see Ceprano as a good candidate for the ancestor of later European populations. It could represent a second wave of migration into Europe, a population that was more advanced than the Dmanisi people, and perhaps one that brought with it the new technology of the Acheulean hand axe. This brings us to the question of technology. The very earliest tools found in Europe, at sites like Cima del Elefante and Pirro Nord, are simple Oldowan flakes and choppers. This fits perfectly with the idea that the first arrivals were part of that initial pre-Acheulean dispersal out of Africa that we see at Dmanisi. They came to Europe with the same simple toolkit that their ancestors had used for 1 million years. But then sometime around 600,000 or 700,000 years ago, a new technology appears in the European archaeological record, the Acheulean hand axe. These beautifully crafted, symmetrical bifacial tools are a clear sign of a new idea and possibly a new population of people arriving on the continent. The appearance of the Acheulean in Europe seems to mark a new phase of colonization, perhaps a more successful and permanent one. This technology and the people who made it, a species we often call Homo heidelbergensis, would come to dominate the European landscape for the next 500,000 years. They were the ancestors of the Neanderthals, and they represent the first truly successful, long-term human adaptation to the challenges of living in Europe. So let's try to synthesize all of this into a coherent story, a plausible scenario for the first peopling of Europe. The story probably begins around the same time as the journey into Asia, perhaps as early as 1.8 million years ago. A population of very primitive, small-brained hominins, very similar to the ones we found at Dmanisi, expanded out of Africa. While some went east, others turned west. They were not well adapted to the cold, so they stuck to the warmest parts of the continent, the Mediterranean coast. They followed the rivers and coastlines, spreading slowly westward, eventually reaching Spain by 1.2 million years ago. They were a hit-and-run population. They would expand during the warm interglacials, and then their populations would crash, or be forced to retreat during the cold glacials. For hundreds of thousands of years, Europe was a frontier, a place of failed colonizations and temporary settlements. There was no permanent, continuous human presence. Then, sometime before 600,000 years ago, something changed. A new wave of hominins arrived. These people, perhaps what we call Homo heidelbergensis, were different. They were bigger, they had larger brains, and they brought with them a new and more sophisticated technology, the Acheulean hand axe. They were better equipped to deal with the challenges of the European environment. They were better hunters, and they may have had better social organization and a greater control of fire. This second wave was much more successful. They managed to establish a permanent and continuous presence on the continent. They spread north out of the Mediterranean refuge and learned to cope with the colder climates of what is now France, Germany, and England. It was this population that would, over the next several 100,000 years, evolve in isolation in Europe and become the famous Neanderthals. This two-stage model, an early, failed colonization by a primitive hominin, followed by a later, successful colonization by a more advanced one, seems to fit the available evidence best. It explains why the earliest sites are so rare and are confined to the south, and it explains the later appearance of the more sophisticated Acheulean technology. It paints a picture of Europe not as a core area of human evolution, but as a difficult and marginal periphery, a continent that was only conquered after a long and difficult struggle. The lives of these first Europeans would have been incredibly tough. They lived in small, scattered groups, in a world that was often cold and unforgiving. They would have competed for resources with a fearsome array of large predators, including a European species of lion, giant hyenas, and the terrifying saber-toothed cat. They hunted the great herds of bison, horse, and giant deer that roamed the plains. They learned the rhythms of the European seasons, the places to find shelter in the winter, and the best spots to intercept migrating herds in the summer. They were pioneers in the truest sense of the word, pushing the boundaries of what a human being was capable of. The evidence from Atapuerca, with its hints of cannibalism, reminds us that their world was one of brutal survival, where the line between life and death was very thin. But they persevered. They laid the groundwork, the first human footprint on a continent that would, much, much later, become a crucible of human history. Their story is a testament to the tenacity and the sheer stubbornness of the human spirit, a spirit that was already burning brightly over 1 million years ago in a lonely cave in the hills of northern Spain. Part 8. Legacy and Extinction. The end of the first wave. We have now come to the end of our long journey. We have followed the footsteps of Homo erectus from their cradle in the great Rift Valley of Africa, across the land bridge of the Levant, and into the vast, unknown territories of Asia and Europe. We have seen them adapt to a staggering variety of new worlds, from the tropical rainforests of Java to the cold, wind-swept plains of northern China and the challenging, fragmented landscapes of early Europe. We have explored how they survived, how their diet, their technology, and their social lives allowed them to become the first truly global human species. But all journeys, no matter how epic, must eventually come to an end. We must now turn our attention to the final chapter in the story of Out of Africa 1. What was the ultimate fate of these pioneers? What was the legacy of this first great human migration? And why are they no longer with us? This is a story of evolution, of transformation, and ultimately of extinction. The first and most important legacy of Homo erectus is their staggering success and longevity. If we measure success in the biological terms of persistence over time, then Homo erectus is without a doubt the most successful human species that has ever lived. Our own species, Homo sapiens, has been around for perhaps 300,000 years. The Neanderthals lasted for about the same amount of time. Homo erectus, on the other hand, walked the Earth for an immense span of time. They first appear in the African fossil record around 2 million years ago, and some of the last surviving populations, in places like Java, may have held on until as recently as 100,000 years ago. That is a run of almost 1.9 million years. It is a length of time that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. They endured countless ice ages, dramatic shifts in climate, volcanic eruptions, and the constant threat of predation. They did not just survive, they thrived and spread across 3 continents. Our own technological civilization, with all its achievements, is just a fleeting moment compared to the long, slow, and steady reign of Homo erectus. They are the great marathon runners of human evolution, and we are just getting started. Their second great legacy was the establishment of a global human presence. Before out of Africa. 1. The human story was a purely African story. All of our ancestors for the first 5 million years of our evolutionary history lived and died on the African continent. It was Homo erectus who broke that mold. They were the ones who took the human experiment and made it global. By spreading into Asia and Europe, they created a whole new set of evolutionary laboratories. For the first time, you had human populations living in very different environments, separated by vast distances, and evolving in relative isolation from one another. This geographic separation and adaptation to different local conditions is the engine of evolution. It is the process that creates new species. The great dispersal of Homo erectus, therefore, set the stage for the next phase of human evolution. It created a complex, multicultural human world. The populations that remained in Africa continued to evolve, eventually giving rise to our own lineage, Homo sapiens. The populations that settled in Europe and Western Asia, isolated by distance and the deserts of the Middle East, embarked on their own unique evolutionary path. Over hundreds of thousands of years, they adapted to the specific challenges of glacial Europe, evolving into the famous Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis. And in Asia, the story is even more complex and still coming into focus. The populations of Homo erectus in East Asia also continued to evolve. For a long time, we knew very little about what happened to them. But in recent years, spectacular fossil finds in China have revealed a whole host of intermediate forms, ancient humans, that are more advanced than classic Homo erectus, but are not Neanderthals or modern humans. And the most shocking discovery of all came from the small Indonesian island of Flores, where a tiny, hobbit-like species called Homo floresiensis survived until as recently as 50,000 years ago, likely having evolved from an isolated population of Homo erectus that had been marooned on the island. Even more recently, the analysis of ancient DNA from a finger bone found in a Siberian cave revealed another, previously unknown group of ancient humans, the Denisovans. Their ancestors too were part of this great Eurasian dispersal. So the world that the next wave of migrants from Africa, our own species, would encounter was not an empty world. It was a world already full of other kinds of humans. When Homo sapiens finally walked out of Africa around 60,000 years ago, they did not step into a virgin planet. They stepped into a world that had been shaped and settled by their ancient cousins for over 1 million years. They met and interacted with the Neanderthals in Europe and the Middle East. They met the Denisovans in Asia, and they may have met the last surviving populations of Homo erectus in Southeast Asia. The legacy of Out of Africa 1 was, therefore, the creation of a human planet, a diverse tapestry of different human forms, all descended from that first pioneering stock. It was the end of the beginning, the moment that humanity went from being a local phenomenon to a global one, setting the stage for the complex and fascinating story of interactions that would eventually lead to us being the last humans standing. This brings us to the final and perhaps most difficult question: what happened to them? Why did this incredibly successful, long-lived and widespread species eventually disappear? There is no single, simple answer. Extinction is a complex process, and the fate of Homo erectus was likely different in different parts of the world. It was not a single event, but a long, slow process of replacement, absorption, and local extinction that played out over hundreds of thousands of years. We can think of their end as having two main causes. They evolved into something new, or they were replaced by something new. In many parts of the world, it is likely that Homo erectus did not go extinct in the classic sense of being wiped out. Instead, they simply evolved. They were the ancestors of what came next. This process of slow, gradual change within a lineage is called anagenesis. Imagine a population of Homo erectus in Europe around 800,000 years ago. Over the next 100,000 years, as they adapt to the local conditions, their brains get a little bigger, their faces change a little, and their technology becomes more sophisticated. At what point do we stop calling them Homo erectus and start calling them by a new name, like Homo heidelbergensis? The line is arbitrary, a convenience for scientists. For the individuals living at the time, there was no sudden change. They were simply having children, and each generation was slightly different from the last. So in Europe, Homo erectus did not so much go extinct as they transformed, through a long evolutionary process, into Homo heidelbergensis, who in turn transformed into the Neanderthals. A similar process likely happened in Africa, where the local populations of Homo erectus, or Homo ergaster, continued to evolve, their brains growing ever larger, their behavior ever more complex, eventually leading to the emergence of our own species, Homo sapiens. In these cases, extinction is a misnomer. It is more like a graduation. The species did not die, it became something else. But this was not the fate of all Homo erectus populations. In other parts of the world, particularly in East and Southeast Asia, the story seems to have been different. Here, it seems that some populations of classic Homo erectus survived for a very long time, persisting with their original body plan and simple technology, long after their cousins in Africa and Europe had evolved into new forms. The fossils from Java are the best evidence for this. Sites like Nandong on the Solo River have produced Homo erectus fossils that are shockingly young. The dating of these sites is very difficult and has been the subject of much debate, but some recent studies suggest they could be as young as 117,000 years ago. If this date is correct, it is a remarkable thought. It means that while our own fully modern human ancestors were living in Africa, and the Neanderthals were hunting mammoths in Ice Age Europe, a relic population of the first great human migrants was still living in the jungles of Java, a living fossil from a much earlier chapter of the human story. They were the last of their kind. Why did they survive so long in this particular corner of the world? It may be that the tropical environment of Southeast Asia was relatively stable compared to the dramatic climate swings of Europe and Northern Asia. Or perhaps their isolation on the islands of Indonesia protected them from competition from the newer, larger-brained human species that were emerging on the mainland. But eventually, their time ran out too. What finally pushed these last survivors over the edge? The answer, most likely, is us. The final disappearance of Homo erectus from the fossil record seems to coincide with the arrival of a new, highly adaptable, and ultimately unstoppable invasive species in their territory, Homo sapiens. As our ancestors spread out of Africa and across Asia, they would have brought with them a suite of advantages. They had more sophisticated tools, including projectile weapons like spears thrown with a spear thrower, and perhaps even the bow and arrow. They had complex symbolic language which would have allowed for better planning, coordination, and the transmission of knowledge. They had more complex social networks that allowed them to live in larger groups and maintain connections over wider areas. When these two populations, the ancient residents and the new arrivals met, the outcome was likely inevitable. It probably was not a story of violent conquest, of spear-wielding modern humans actively hunting down their more primitive cousins. The process was likely more subtle. The newly arrived Homo sapiens were simply more efficient at exploiting the environment. They were better hunters, better gatherers, and they had faster population growth. They would have outcompeted the resident Homo erectus for the best food resources, the best shelters, and the best raw materials for tools. Over a period of a few thousand years, the Homo erectus population would have found it harder and harder to make a living. Their numbers would have dwindled, their groups would have become smaller and more isolated, and eventually they would have just faded away. The last campfire of the last group of Homo erectus on Java would have flickered out, and with it, a chapter of human history that had lasted for nearly 2 million years came to a quiet and unceremonious end. The final legacy of Out of Africa. One, then, is a profound and perhaps a little melancholy. It is a reminder that in the long story of evolution, no species, no matter how successful, is guaranteed to last forever. Homo erectus were the great pioneers, the original explorers who proved that the human lineage had what it took to conquer the world. They were resilient, they were adaptable, and they were survivors on a scale that we can barely imagine. They laid the foundation upon which all subsequent human history was built. Their journey out of Africa was the single most important event in the first 2/3 of the human story. It transformed us from a local African primate into the seeds of a global phenomenon. Every single person alive today, no matter where on earth they live, is a beneficiary of that first ancient journey. We carry the legacy of their adventurous spirit in our very genes, in our innate human curiosity, and our restless desire to see what lies over the next horizon. The world they made, a world of many different kinds of humans, is gone. We are now alone, the last surviving twig on a once bushy family tree. But as we look back at the faint, fossilized trail of these first explorers, we are looking back at our own deep history. Their story is our story. It is the story of the first time our ancestors looked up from their African home, and, for reasons we have explored, whether pushed by climate, pulled by food, or simply driven by a slow demographic expansion, they began to walk, and they just kept walking generation after generation until the sun rose on a human world, a world where the descendants of an African ape could be found on the shores of the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Oceans. They were the first wave, the ones who opened the door to the planet. Their story is a humbling reminder of our deep past and of the incredible, improbable journey that led, eventually, to us.